and when they both stepped in the home, they felt the house was built for their family. On the other hand, they may have felt that way, but their daughter Molly didn't get the same vibes as they did. The moment Molly stepped into their home, she felt an evil presence and told her parents something didn't feel right. Just like all parents, they told her to give it time because it's foreign to her, and as the days go, she'll warm up to it. Molly said, "I hope you're both right." The first night, everything seemed okay, but a few days later, Molly was having terrible nightmares, and her parents started to worry about their daughter, as any normal parent would. The next day, Molly was sent to a doctor to have herself checked out, but nothing was found wrong. Everything was fine. But, like clockwork every night, Molly would have the same dream, causing her to scream out loud in the middle of the night to her parents. Molly's parents had all they could take from their daughter's screaming in the night, and saying to them that they were coming to get her soul. When Molly's parents came to check on her every night, she became more violent and would curse and spit on them, and her voice was that of a demon. Molly's father, Jack, decided it might be a good idea to call a priest, see if she was possessed. Jack got in touch with Father Ryan at the church, and just about a mile from where they live. Jack's voice shook. He could barely get the words out, because it was his daughter he loved so dearly and felt hopeless to save her from what was possessing her body. As Jack was discussing his daughter's problem to Father Ryan over the phone, he reassured Jack he had seen this kind of behavior before and would do everything in his power to rid the daughter from the evilness she possessed inside her body. Father Ryan said, "Let me get my things together. I'm going to need them to perform an exorcism. I will be over shortly." "Thank you so much," replied Jack. Father Ryan knew time was at hand, and there was no time to waste because the possession described by Jack over the phone would be enough to kill Jack's daughter before the night set in. He grabbed his Bible, holy water, and placed them in his bag. He got in his car and sped down the road to Jack's house, ready to rid the girl of the evil demons. He pulled into Jack's driveway and gathered his things and knocked on the front door. Jack opened the door and said, please hurry, she's speaking in different languages, she's levitating off the bed, she's throwing up." Father Ryan and Jack cautiously entered the bedroom. Molly said, "Welcome, Father Ryan. Come over here and give me a big kiss." Then she spat bloody red substance at his body and said, "I know you want to stick your tongue in my mouth." Father Ryan opened his Bible and started reading verses and throwing holy water at her, which just upset the demon inside of her. Then Molly's feet touched the floor and ran towards Father Ryan, pushing him to the floor on his back, and started licking his face, saying, "I know you like it." Father Ryan did his best to keep his composure, but this demon was out for blood. The holy water helped somewhat, along with reading verses from the Bible, but this demon was too strong, and put both hands on the priest's head. Then with a quick twist, his head was severed from his body. The demon held his head in the air and let out a demonic laugh. "Did you think bringing a priest would stop me from destroying this girl's body?" Then the demon possessed Molly and threw the head at her father. Jack's wife Brenda started screaming and said, "Please don't hurt my daughter. Take me instead," begged Brenda. The demon said, "Shut your mouth. This body is mine. Nothing you say or do will change that." Brenda dropped to her knees, sobbing, saying, "She's our only child. She's done nothing wrong to deserve this." The demon replied, "Okay, I've had enough of your whining." Molly's possessed body walked to her mother, and in Molly's voice said, "Goodbye, Mummy." Then the demon took back possession of her body, placed both thumbs on each eye and pressed them in as far as they could go, as she screamed bloody murder. Jack tried to fight off the demon, but the demon threw Jack against the wall so hard he fell unconscious. Molly tried to get enough energy to stop the demon from losing her soul, but it was no use. Then there was a loud banging on the front door, because the next-door neighbours could hear Brenda's blood-curdling screams, so the police were called out to investigate. The cops got no response. They kicked in the door. And as the demon was about to finish off Jack, they entered the bedroom and told Molly to freeze, as the cold demon hands were about to twist Jack's head off of his shoulders. Again, the police repeated, "Freeze or we'll shoot." There was no response from Molly, so the police opened fire, killing her instantly. Jack was all alone. He lost two of the most precious people he held dear to his heart. Jack was taken by ambulance to the hospital for observation, but shortly after he was released. Jack was lying in bed thinking, and he started drinking beer after beer and began crying. He felt he couldn't go any longer without his wife and daughter, so he pulled a revolver from the nightstand, put it to his head, and pulled the trigger. Sometimes when evil is at your heels, no matter how hard you try to devour it, it just happens anyway, leaving behind broken hearts that will never mend, no matter how hard you try to block out the tragedy that unfolded right before your eyes. The end. And those are another 3 stories from Drac von Stoller. Thank you so much for listening, and many blessings. Wisteria, energy, twister. Wisteria, energy, twister. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the collection by Drac von Stoller. This story is called Ashes to Ashes. In the heart of the darkest forest, shrouded in perpetual mist, stood the ruins of Sir Jacob Edward's castle, a grim reminder of his malevolence. The castle's chilling aura had a way of creeping into the souls of those who dared approach, leaving them shivering in fear before even crossing the threshold. The legends whispered of restless souls that wandered the castle's corridors, eternally trapped in their torment. The wind howled through the broken windows, a mournful wail that seemed to carry the anguished cries of the prisoners who had met their gruesome fate there. As night fell, an eerie glow emanated from the dungeon, casting flickering shadows of the decaying walls. Each shadow a reminder of the bone-snapping horrors that had taken place within. On the anniversary of Sir Jacob's death, a thick fog enveloped the castle grounds, a veil between the living and the dead growing thin. In the castle's dungeon, the air grew cold and heavy, and the shackles that once held the prisoners seemed to rattle and clank of their own accord. Whispers of agony and despair echoed through the chambers, as if the very walls were haunted by the memories of the tortured souls. As the clock struck midnight, the ghostly apparitions of the prisoners materialized, their gaunt faces twisted in internal pain. Hollow eyes stared into the darkness, seeking vengeance against the tormentor who had taken pleasure in their suffering. They wandered the corridors, their moans mingling with the creaks of the decaying castle, creating a symphony of terror that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who dare listen. In the centre of the dungeon, the ashes of Sir Jacob had been scattered, a cruel mockery of his once formidable presence. But his malevolence lingered, his spirit unable to rest. Forever bound to the dungeon, he had ruled with an iron fist. His phantom footsteps echoed through the stone halls, a sinister reminder that the reign of terror had not truly ended. As the years rolled on, the ruins of Sir Jacob's castle became a macabre attraction for those seeking a thrill beyond the realm of the living. Ghost tours were organized, promising a spine-tingling journey into the heart of darkness, where the whispers of the tormented soul still echoed. People from far and wide would gather on the castle grounds, their curiosity outweighing their fear as they embarked on these chilling expeditions. The tour guides would lead groups through the echoing halls, their lanterns casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls like phantoms themselves. With each step, the visitors could feel the weight of the history that hung heavily in the air, as if the very stones held memories of agony and suffering. However, it wasn't long before the castle's sinister reputation began to manifest in terrifying ways. People who ventured into the castle on these tours would sometimes vanish without a trace, leaving behind only an eerie silence that seemed to swallow their presence whole. Stories began to circulate about ghostly hands pulling visitors into the shadows, their screams simply fading into the night. Desperate for answers, a group of renowned ghost hunters arrived at the castle, equipped with advanced technology and determination to uncover the truth behind the tales. They set up cameras, motion sensors, EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recording devices, ready to capture any evidence of the supernatural. Confident in their expertise, they entered the castle with bravado, dismissing the warnings of locals. As the ghost hunters delved deeper into the castle's darkness, their devices began to malfunction, inexplicably. Batteries drained at the alarming rate, lights flickered uncontrollably, and static-filled voices whispered chilling warnings through the EVP recorders. Despite the increasing sense of unease that gnawed at their confidence, the hunters pressed on, determined to conquer the forces they believed they could control. In the heart of the dungeon, the ghostly apparitions of the tortured prisoners materialized, their eyes burning with a malevolent fire. The hunters' presence had awakened a dormant fury, and the spirits were eager to make their tormentors suffer once more. Shadows enveloped the hunters, their equipment now completely useless, leaving them vulnerable to the spirits with vengeful intentions. As the first hunter felt an icy grip close around his throat, he realized the true depth of his mistake. The other hunters watched in horror as their comrade was lifted from the ground, his face contorted in agony. The remaining members of the group tried to flee, but the castle seemed to twist and shift, leading them further into a labyrinth of passages. One by one, the hunters met their grisly fates. Bones snapped, limbs contorted at unnatural angles, their terrified screams swallowed by the wails from the ghosts. And the walls had witnessed countless horrors before anyway. The spirits of the prisoners had claimed their revenge, ensuring that those who sought to exploit their suffering would share in their torment. As dawn broke, the castle returned to its eerie silence, the misty forest absorbing the secrets of the night. The ghost tours ceased, replaced by hushed whispers and haunted glances exchanged among the villagers. The castle remained a forbidden place, a cursed reminder of evils that had once resided there. And so, the legend of Sir Jacob Edward's castle endured, a cautionary tale of the price one pays for indulging in darkness. The ruins continued to stand, a haunting relic of bygone era, where the lines between life and death, torment and vengeance, were forever blurred. Those who gazed upon the castle couldn't help but wonder if the anguished cries of the past still echoed through the mist, a chilling reminder that some horrors should never be disturbed. The end. And that's the end of this story by Drac von Stoller. Interesting. I'm sure there's many stories of many haunted ruins out there. That's just another one. Thank you for listening and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the stories by Drac von Stoller. This next story is called The Inheritance. Countess York was a wealthy but mean, spoiled woman who upon her husband's death inherited not only his wealth, but his cold-heartedness. The Countess's husband was wealthy, was an oil tycoon. He handled all his affairs with an iron fist. The minute her husband died, the Countess had plenty of money to give her husband an expensive funeral. But, being taught by a man with a cold heart and iron fist, he was lucky to have been put in a pine box. The Countess had ice water pumping through her veins, but not enough to make her bury her husband in a shallow grave on their estate. He was at least put in the family cemetery. After the funeral, Countess York immediately called the attorney's office to get on with the reading of the will. The Countess showed up early for the reading, continually knocking on the attorney's door. "Are you done yet?" and frantically pacing back and forth by the door. Finally, the door opened and the Countess burst inside and sat down in front of the attorney's desk and said, "Let's get on with it. I haven't got all day." The attorney replied, "Since there's no living relatives left, everything's been left to you." Countess York replied, "Where do I sign?" The Countess signed the legal documents and gathered her things. Countess York went back to the estate to clear her husband's things out of the closet when she spotted a relatively large box. The Countess opened the box in amazement at what she had just found. "It's a crown of jewels. This must be worth a fortune," said the Countess in excitement. It was her wicked grandmother's crown. One thing that slipped the Countess's mind was that the crown was cursed by a gypsy woman who was slain by her father to cover up the affair they were having. Just before he slit his mistress's throat, she put a curse on the crown of jewels that if anyone dares to put on the crown, they will surely die. When the crown is placed on the head, needles from the bottom rim of the crown would pierce the brain and bring on sudden death. The Countess had no idea about the affair her husband had with this gypsy woman, or any purpose the crown had to a curse. The Countess knew the crown was precious, so she slowly picked the crown out of the box and placed it on her head, and went over to the mirror to admire the beautiful crown. Then all of a sudden, the curse the gypsy put on the crown was happening right before the Countess's eyes. Needle after needle started piercing the Countess's brain. She screamed louder and louder. By the time the butler and maid arrived, the Countess was lying on the floor with blood all over her head, and the crown floated back to the box in the closet, right where she found it. There was no trace of blood on the crown anywhere, and all the needle piercings disappeared. When the autopsy was performed on the Countess, there were no needle marks in the skull. Her death was ruled as natural causes. They thought possible aneurysm. By some coincidence, the Countess had just finished her will in case something happened to her on the same day that she died. She did it. How strange is that? The butler and the maid were not sure what their future held, since the Countess was no more. The Countess oppressed the maid and the butler all of the 30-plus years they served her. As the maid and the butler were cleaning the Countess's room, the maid stumbled upon the box with the cursed crown. The maid said, Look, there's a beautiful crown inside this box. I bet the Countess hasn't even noticed it was here." The maid reached in the box and pulled out the crown and proceeded to put it on. The butler jerked it out of her hands and said, "We don't even know if the Countess had a will. Who's to say if we're in it even? You know how badly she treated both of us throughout the service to the family. Why should anything good come of this?" Come to find out, they were both wrong. The butler and the maid were both included in the will. The butler went back to the closet, where the maid acquired the crown and placed it back in the box and said, "If there is a will and we're included, the crown will be yours regardless." The maid and the butler finished cleaning the rest of the mansion. Just as they were locking up, the phone rang. The butler answered the phone, and sure enough, it was the attorney's office, asking for the maid and the butler's presence for the reading of the Countess York's will tomorrow at 10 a.m. The butler and maid were jumping for joy. So excited. "Let's open a bottle of bubbly. Celebrate tonight." So they drank 2 bottles of bubbly and passed out from the Countess's bed. The butler and maid woke up the next morning with a hangover, and they sure had to down a couple of pots of coffee and shower off, so they could be alert to the reading of the will, which was just a few hours away. The butler and the maid managed to get themselves together for the reading of the will. They climbed into the Countess's Rolls Royce and headed straight for the attorney's office, anticipating all the money and possessions they would acquire. The 20-minute ride seemed to last forever, and the car wouldn't get there fast enough for both of them. The butler and maid finally reached their destination, put the car in park. Both the maid and butler jumped out of the car and raced upstairs to the attorney's office. The butler knocked on the door, and the secretary answered it, then escorted the maid and butler to the conference room for the reading of the will. The maid and the butler sat down at the table, waiting for the attorney to arrive, and of course, the attorney was running a little late. "Sorry for the delay. My car was stuck in heavy traffic," said the attorney. "Shall we proceed with the reading?" "Yes, please do," said the butler. "We should be able to wrap this up in 30 minutes. You can both go home and relax for the rest of the night," said the attorney. "Does anyone have any further questions?" asked the attorney. "No," said the impatient maid. "Then let's begin, shall we? I, Countess York of sound body and mind, leave my entire estate to my dear maid Claire. And as for Henry the butler, I have nothing but a bus fare to Chicago I leave." Henry the butler was furious and stormed out of the attorney's office. He took his bags out of the Rolls Royce and walked 2 blocks to the nearest bus stop, got aboard the bus and headed back to his family's home. Henry couldn't believe all the years he spent with the Countess's constant badgering, and not talking back didn't even go noticed. There was nothing in the will. Months and months passed by. Henry became an alcoholic, living in the back seat of a Studebaker his parents bought him when he was a teenager. Then one day, as Henry was fast asleep in his Studebaker, his mother came running out to the car, banging on the window. Henry, get up. You've got a phone call. I believe it's Claire, the maid, and she wants to speak to you." Henry sat up, took a big swig of tequila and opened the car door, staggered onto the ground. "Henry, I wish you would stop drinking and clean yourself up," said Henry's mother. "Oh, stop whining. She probably wants to brag about how wonderful her life is, and how it's a shame I'm a drunkard who lives in the back seat of a car." Henry could barely keep his footing as he approached the stairs to the house. After a couple of falls, Henry grabbed the receiver and said, "What do you want from me? Why don't you leave me alone? Go lie in your pile of money and sip on some champagne." Claire replied, "Henry, that's not why I called. My reason for calling you was to see if you could come by and stay on as my partner. I'm willing to give you 50% of everything. Now, before you say another word, clean yourself up, get on the next flight here, and I'll discuss the details with you." "Is this some joke?" Henry said. "No, it isn't," replied Claire. "Now, will you come on, or am I going to have to go down there and drag you here myself?" Claire said in an angry voice. "Okay, I'll be there in a couple of hours," said Henry. Henry packed his bags, drove to the airport, boarded his flight. Henry's plane arrived ahead of schedule, and Claire was waiting patiently at the gate for Henry to arrive. Henry arrived at the gate, and Claire was there to drive him to the estate. "I'm so glad you decided to come help me run this estate. It's just too much for a woman to do all by herself," Henry replied. "It's still hard to believe you need someone like me that is at rock bottom to take such a burden on." Claire said, "No one knows this place as well as you do, not even me. So let's start over and try to forget how badly we both treated by the Countess. Let's just enjoy the wealth that was left behind." Henry and Claire were no longer anyone's maid and butler, and could do whatever they wanted inside and outside the estate. Everything was going well for both of them for a couple more months, until Claire decided she wanted to put a dress on, and she wanted to wear the crown to show off to Henry. But little did she know this would be her last time to dress up for anyone. Claire got all prettied up for Henry before he got to the box out. Henry was sitting by the fire reading, as he always did in the late afternoons, when Claire appeared before him, dancing around and giggling. "Henry, put that book down." "What do you think?" said Claire. "I think you look wonderful in that dress you're wearing." "What's in that box?" asked Henry. "Something that belongs to the Countess. Now that her possessions belong to us, I can now wear it with my dress. Let me just put it on, and my dress will be complete," said Claire. Claire reached in the box, pulled out the crown, and placed the crown on top of her head. Then all of a sudden, Claire was about to feel the gypsy's curse. Claire started screaming at the top of her lungs, "Get this thing off of me!" She was bleeding profusely from the top of her skull. Henry jumped off the couch and tried his best to pull the crown off her skull, but the gypsy's curse was too strong to break. Claire dropped to the floor, and the crown released its grip from Claire's skull. "Claire is dead," said Henry. Henry glanced over at the fireplace and could faintly see the ghost of a man laughing. And that's when he knew the crown was cursed. The rumours of the gypsy were true. Henry thought the story was made up by the Countess's husband to make the Countess jealous. Henry picked up the crown and said, "Die, gypsy, die." Then Henry threw the crown in the fireplace and watched as the once beautiful golden crown melted before his eyes. As the crown was burning, Henry could see the gypsy's ghostly figure screaming out for help. But Henry just ignored the gypsy's pleas and watched the crown disappear along with the gypsy's curse. Henry was all by himself, with nothing to do in the mansion but count his money. Now that Claire was gone, all the inheritance money was his. Henry lived out the rest of his days at the estate, gambling, drinking, fast women, until the well ran dry. Henry was again penniless. During his last night in the mansion, he had terrifying dreams of the gypsy woman. She was coming back to finish him off. Henry was at his lowest point in life and too weak to fight the dreams. The voice in his dreams kept on telling him to open the nightstand next to the bed, take out the revolver, put the gun to his head and pull the trigger. Finally, Henry couldn't take any more. So, he pulled out the revolver and blew his brains out. Shortly after Henry pulled the trigger, the mansion caught on fire. All of the horrific memories along went up in flames with him. Did the gypsy seek revenge from the grave? Or is it just a coincidence? We may never know the real truth. So, what do you think, guys? Do you think it was the gypsy's curse? Or do you think it was possible that it may have been a coincidence and he just lost his mind and went mad? Because obviously he was a drunk, he was gambling all the money away. It could have been either or either. But you tell me what you think. Thank you for listening to this story and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to the collection by Drac von Stoller. This story is called Dorabella's Revenge from the Grave. The Baron de Graaf and his wife Dorabella lived in a beautiful castle in Scotland. They were so in love, and it showed at their lavish parties in the ballroom. The Baron was a jealous husband. If any man laid eyes on Dorabella in a way that made him uncomfortable, they would be brought to the dungeon and put on the chopping block, thus losing their head. Not many men dare test the jealous Baron, because if they did, Dorabella would be the last woman they would ever see again. Dorabella loved her husband dearly, but with his suspicious eyes, it made things hard on their marriage, which made Dorabella resent her husband even more. The Baron would like to show off Dorabella's beauty at their parties in front of their guests. The Baron's jealousy was about to come to a head because the Baroness had all she could take, which made her take a liking to one of the groundskeepers. While her husband was out hunting the Baroness Dorabella, and the groundskeeper were upstairs rolling around in the sheets, making passionate love, the Baron's jealous heart made him decide to arrive home earlier than his wife expected, thus catching his wife and the groundskeeper in the act. Seeing his wife in bed with another man pushed him over the edge. The Baron decided to have them both killed. The Baron told them both to get out of bed and head straight to the dungeon, where they could die together. The Baron and 2 of his servants escorted Baroness Dorabella and the groundskeeper unclothed to the dungeon to be put on the rack. Then had their limbs ripped from their bodies as their punishment for adulteress acted by a crime committed they did. As Dorabella was being stretched out on the rack, she screamed out and cursed her husband for what he was doing to them both. The Baron said to his wife, Dorabella, you should have thought about the consequences of a jealous husband before you leaped into bed with your lover. Now it's going to cost both of your lives. What I've got in store for you, my lovely Dorabella, that will preserve your beauty, is to pour hot wax all over your body before the burial. What do you think about that, dear Baroness? Dorabella replied, you're an evil man, and I will seek revenge from the grave. You can count on it. The Baron just laughed and said, I don't think you're in any position right now to be saying you'll be coming back from the dead. Once the coffin is lowered into the cold, dark ground, and the dirt is piled high on your grave, nothing, and I mean nothing, is going to bring you back, my dear Dorabella. The Baron and his 2 servants started pouring hot wax from their buckets as she lay there, helpless and screaming at the top of her lungs. The Baron decided to end her suffering, so he kissed her on the forehead and slowly pushed his knife into her chest, piercing her heart, and the screaming stopped. Then the Baron and his 2 servants finished pouring the remaining hot wax, covering her entire body. The Baron's 2 servants wrapped her wax-covered body in a blanket and carried her to the coffin. The Baron said his last goodbyes and closed the casket, and his 2 servants proceeded to pile dirt on top of it until the grave was filled. Baron de Graaf's life just wasn't the same because of his love for Dorabella. The Baron would pace back and forth in his bedroom contemplating on digging her up, bringing her back. You know, a wax-covered body could be laid in bed. But if he did that morbid deed, his servants might think he was weird. The Baron said to himself, this is my castle, and if I want to dig up the only woman I ever loved, then I will. Later on, in the night when all the servants were asleep, the Baron got the shovel and went down to Dorabella's grave to dig her up. As the Baron was digging and weeping over her grave, he could have sworn he heard Dorabella's voice. The Baron's shovel finally hit Dorabella's coffin, so he scraped off the last layer of dirt from the top of the coffin and opened her casket, and there she was, all wrapped in blankets. The Baron picked up Dorabella's stiff body, carrying her back to the castle to their bedroom, removed her body from the sheets and placed her on the bed. To keep the servants from discovering his little secret, he would always keep the bedroom door locked, and if he found out anyone entered the room without his permission, they would lose their heads. The Baron would bring food every night to her and talk to her as though she was still alive. The Baron was starting to spend too much time in the room, neglecting his duties as a Baron. The Baron's servants were not getting paid on time, so they told the Baron they were quitting the next day. As months went by, the once beautiful castle with lavish parties was no more. The manor went to ruins. The Baron had dreams that Dorabella was going to have a revenge on him. Since Dorabella's body was removed from her cold grave for so long, the wax on her body was slowly melting off. The stench from her body was unbearable, but the Baron just sprayed perfume on her corpse to keep the smell down. Finally, one night, as the Baron lay there sleeping next to Dorabella in bed, Dorabella was about to get the revenge she promised her husband. The next morning, when one of the servants came back to the castle to retrieve something they forgot to take with them before they left, the servant called out to the Baron, but got no answer. The servant decided to go upstairs to the Baron's room to say goodbye for the last time. When the servant opened the door, he got the shock of his life. There lying on the bed was the Baron and his dead wife, Dorabella. What frightened the servant the most was that Dorabella's hands were around the Baron's throat, and when the servant went to get a closer look, the Baron's face was that of a man who was frightened to death. The Baron was dead all right. The servant said Dorabella was seeking revenge on the Baron. She finally got what she wished for him to happen. The end. That's an interesting story indeed. Imagine having that happen in your real life. Thank you for listening, and many blessings. Wisteria, energy, twister. Wisteria, energy, twister. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the stories by Drakmon Stoller. This story is called Curse of the Crystal Skull. Have you ever wondered in the back of your mind, what if you could make a wish and it could come true? That's what happened to Dr. Murray when he went on an expedition with a group of archaeologists to the Aztec ruins. Dr. Murray was a big dreamer with an overactive imagination, so even if he were to tell someone that he made a wish and it came true, no one would actually believe him. Dr. Murray is what you would call the little boy who cried wolf. Dr. Murray was one of 7 young archaeologists eager to make a name for himself. He planned an expedition for him and his archaeologist friends in May. The archaeologists that were going on the Aztec expedition were Dr. Murray, Dr. Morley, Dr. Weber, Dr. Sanchez, Dr. Seymour, Dr. Roberts, and Dr. Bell. The skies were blue that day. The flight took off from the Aztec ruins expedition. Dr. Murray sat next to Dr. Bell on the plane. Dr. Murray's overactive imagination was already kicking in, and his mouth wouldn't shut up during the flight. Dr. Murray was telling stories about his great-uncle Henry, who was an archaeologist. Henry was part of the first archaeologists that made significant discoveries at the Aztec ruins. Of course, Dr. Bell knew that was a lie because Dr. Bell knew Dr. Murray's uncle Henry, and he was a drunk. And the only thing remotely close to him being an archaeologist was digging up bones in his backyard. Dr. Bell finally heard enough of Dr. Murray's far-fetched stories and put his headphones on and turned up the music to drown out Dr. Murray's motor mouth. Dr. Murray said, "I guess I'll just read a magazine." Dr. Bell just closed his eyes and slept as the music poured through his headphones, drowning out any background noise, including Dr. Murray. The small twin-engine plane carrying the 7 archaeologists finally landed at the destination, the Aztec ruins. The 7 archaeologists got their luggage and headed to their hotel, where they would be staying during the expedition. The archaeologists got something to eat, got dressed, gathered their equipment for the expedition. The 7 archaeologists piled into the van with their stuff and headed to the Aztec ruins to start the expedition. The archaeologists weren't even on the road 5 minutes when Dr. Murray began his stories yet again. They were just flying out of his mouth. The drive to the dig site was about an hour away. The other archaeologists weren't interested in Dr. Murray's stories, so they talked amongst each other and talked over Dr. Murray, trying to drown out the conversation. At last, we're here, said Dr. Bell. Dr. Bell was in charge of the Aztec expedition, even though he didn't do the actual planning. Dr. Bell had done his homework and knew way more than Dr. Murray would have ever known. The archaeologists were led to the Aztec ruins by a guide to get them familiar with them. Dr. Murray didn't like playing second fiddle to no one and wasn't interested in the ruins. Dr. Murray had his eyes set on something much bigger. The something much bigger was 3 crystal skulls. The legend has it that if these crystal skulls were placed in a triangular formation, and if controlled by the wrong hands, well, they could destroy everything, including the earth. Dr. Murray wouldn't stop at anything to get his hands on these 3 crystal skulls and demonstrate his power to his colleagues. And he had a good idea of the location of them. But it would not be very accessible getting to them. There's a cave that's about a mile from the ruins, but Dr. Murray would have to persuade one of the guides to take him there. Of course, Dr. Murray was able to convince one of the guys to take him to the cave with some gold that was found in the ruins by Dr. Morley. When Dr. Murray arrived at the cave with his guide, he asked the guide to show him the location of the skulls. The guide refused, but Dr. Murray offered more gold, and he accepted. The guide told Dr. Murray, "I will only point you in the right direction, but then you're on your own." Dr. Murray followed the treacherous path to the cave along the waterfall, hoping the guide wasn't telling him a bunch of bull. Dr. Murray entered the cave. "That was easy," he said. Then Dr. Murray slipped on wet algae coated on the ledge, which did indeed almost cost him his life. Luckily, a vine was about a foot away, hanging vertically next to his right arm. Dr. Murray held onto the vine for dear life. With all his might, he was able to get back into the cave unarmed. Dr. Murray was a little frightened, but he was too determined to find the crystal skulls and unleash the power that could destroy the earth. Dr. Murray's colleagues were starting to wonder where he was, but figured he was probably telling one of his stories to one of the guides. So they just thought he would show up at any time. Dr. Murray found the entrance to the location to the crystal skulls, but the guide told Dr. Murray no one has ever brought one, let alone 3 crystals, out of that cave. The guide also told Dr. Murray that there was an instance when an archaeologist like himself had one of the crystal skulls in his hand. Just as he was about to exit the cave, he was found dead. And what was strange, in his hand, there was no crystal, and his head was missing. His head was never found. The 3 crystal skulls were still in their place behind the secret passage in the wall of the cave. All Dr. Murray had on his mind was how powerful he would be with the crystal skull's power. Dr. Murray didn't tell the guide that one of his ancestors of the Aztecs told Dr. Murray the mantra to be able to remove the crystal skulls from the cave successfully. Dr. Murray pulled the parchment paper from his jacket and recited the exact words to receive the power from the skulls. Dr. Murray would get the energy from the skulls that would cost him his head. After Dr. Murray recited the words, the 3 skulls were glowing bright green, illuminating essence. Then the 3 skulls formed into one massive skull. Dr. Murray was waiting patiently for the powers from the skull. The skull was still glowing bright green, and it was hovered above Mr. Murray's head. Then his head exploded off his shoulders. The crystal skull took place where Dr. Murray's head used to be sitting on his shoulders. Then Dr. Murray's body, with the crystal skull attached on top of his bloody shoulders, headed out of the cave and back to the Aztec ruins. Dr. Weber said to the other archaeologists at the Aztec ruins, "What's that glowing object? Over there, it's heading towards the ruins." "I'm not sure," said Dr. Bell. Dr. Seymour said in a frightened voice, "Whatever it is, it's heading our direction." Dr. Murray's body with the glowing crystal skull approached the archaeologists with one thing in mind: destroy all human beings. Dr. Roberts asked, "Isn't that Dr. Murray's jacket?" Dr. Sanchez answered, "Yeah, I know that jacket anywhere. There's blood all over the jacket. Where is his head? Where is his head? Where is his head? There's some skull glowing on his shoulders." "Something is very wrong with this picture," said Dr. Morley. Then the crystal skull spoke, telling the archaeologists, "I'm here to destroy all human beings." Dr. Roberts approached the body with the crystal skull and said, "Okay, Dr. Murray, take that ridiculous skull off the top of your head and stop clowning around." Just as Dr. Roberts put his hands on the skull to remove it from Dr. Murray's body, a laser beam came from both eye sockets and vaporized Dr. Roberts' body. The other archaeologists started running for their lives, but the crystal skull proved to be too powerful to escape any of its power. The archaeologists were hunted down and vaporized without a trace. The army was called in because the crystal skull wiped out every human in the state. The army had the crystal skull cornered, but the Crystal Skull wasn't going down without a fight. Most of the army was wiped out. But the only way to slow down the Crystal Skull's destruction was to destroy the body. That was the idea, destroy the body, destroy the skull, right? A descendant of the Aztecs stepped in, told the army to back off and that he knew how to remove the curse. The Aztec man said the mantra, and the crystal skull broke apart and formed 3 separate skulls. The Aztec man took the 3 crystal skulls back to the cave and locked them behind the wall forever, until of course some of the greedy archaeologists, thirsty for power, comes along and persuades one of the guys to reveal the location again. Dr. Murray's hunger for power did nothing but bring death and destruction in a sacred city. Now that the 3 skulls are safe behind the wall of the cave, the town once again is at peace. The end. That's very interesting. I mean, can you imagine seeing a person with a glowing skull on their head? I mean, I don't know, that's really weird. Thank you for listening to this story. What an interesting one. The next story from Drac von Stoller is called Dead Man's Chest. Captain Salty Sam and his crew were some of the most feared pirates of the 7 seas during the 1500s. Whenever the Salty Sam ship, the White Pearl, was sailing nearer the boats. If any vessel got too close to the White Pearl, it was evident they would be greeted with cannon fire. And if any gold were aboard the ship, Salty Sam and his crew, they would claim it. Salty Sam was about to meet his match when Captain Pegleg's ship, the Black Death, came inches beside the White Pearl, almost scraping its side. This angered Captain Salty Sam. Salty Sam shouted at Captain Pegleg's boat, "No one, and I mean no one, treads the same waters of the White Pearl without a fight." Salty Sam shouted out to his men, "Get the cannons ready! When I give the signal, fire upon that ship. I want it sunk." His men were ready for battle. Salty Sam shouted out to the other ship, "Ahoy! What are ye doing in me waters?" Captain Pegleg answered, "This is what I'm doing," as he laughed and then said to his men, "Fire!" His men fired upon the White Pearl, and the fierce battle arose. But Captain Pegleg's, the Black Death ship, was too strong for Captain Salty Sam's ship, the White Pearl. After intense cannon fire, the White Pearl surrendered, and Captain Pegleg's men boarded the White Pearl and took all their gold. As the ship, the White Pearl, was slowly sinking in the sea with its captain and crew members, Captain Pegleg said to his men, "That was easy, easy, mateys," and laughed. Then the ship, the Black Death, sailed further out to sea in search of an island to bury the treasure. One of his men yelled, "Look, Captain, there's an island in the distance, ought to be perfect spot for burying that treasure chest." "Me hearties, why don't you men open a bottle of rum? Toast to our victory of the White Pearl." Captain Pegleg said in a drunken state he was staggering around his ship, the Black Death, saying, "Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. Dead men tell no tales." Captain Pegleg went up to one of his men and said, "Hand me your spyglass so I can see if any ships are in the area before we hide the treasure chest." "Let's get some grub before we drop anchor," Captain Pegleg said. He was pretty drunk. Captain Pegleg and his men filled their bellies with lots of rum, passed out on deck on their ship, and then ran aground on the island. It looks like Captain Pegleg and his rum-filled crew were stranded. When Captain Pegleg woke from his drunken state on his ship, the Black Death was taking too much water to keep it afloat. The captain stood up and said, "Shiver me timbers! Looks like we're not going anywhere for a while, you men." The captain shouted to his men, "Grab all the grub, rum, and treasure chests before the time runs out." His crew grabbed all they could and rounded up and boarded their lifeboat and headed inland to the island. Several months later, Captain Pegleg's men succumbed to scurvy and died. Captain Pegleg only lasted a couple more days before he died of scurvy, but he was able to bury the treasure. The captain left a note stating that any man who dares take me wealth will die at the hands of my crew and me. Captain Pegleg's treasure was undiscovered until 1973, when a group of treasure hunters got off course during a storm, causing the ship to run ground on the island. Captain Johnny Edwards and his eager treasure hunters thought their treasure hunting days were over, but their luck and their lives were about to change. Captain Johnny Edwards and his treasure hunters boarded the lifeboat and paddled to shore. The captain's treasure hunters consisted of his wife, Susan Edwards, Tim Smith, David Jones, and Tim's brother, Brian. "What a beautiful island," replied Susan. Everyone climbed out of the boat to explore the island. The captain told them to split up and look for food and water. As Brian and Tim were exploring, Brian said, "I think I'll lie down for a little while. I'm feeling a little dizzy." Just as Brian laid his head on a rock, he turned his head to the right and yelled, "Tim! Tim, there's an arm sticking out of the ground. There's a skull beside it." Tim told his brother to get the captain. The captain, Davy, Susan and Brian were excited to see what their treasure-seeking friend found. The captain asked Brian, "What is it that you've found?" Brian answered, "There's an arm sticking out of the ground with a skull next to it." The captain replied, "You may have just found a pirate's treasure," laughed him. But the captain and his treasure-seeking friends were about to open a can of whoop-ass. David chimed in and said, "Let's dig and see if there's some pirate treasure here." The men dug with their bare hands until one of the men's hands touched a piece of wood. David shouted out and said, "I think there is pirate's treasure, buried right here." "There is some buried treasure here. I can feel it in my salty dog bones," laughed Davy. Susan chimed in and said, "Salty dog bones? Do you think you're some pirate?" Davy got up and stumbled upon a half-buried hat in the sand on the other side of the palm tree. Davy picked up the hat and said, "Wow, I found a real pirate's hat." He dusted off the old pirate hat and put it on his head, saying, "Looky here, I'm a pirate, you matey," as he danced around the palm tree. "Take that hat off," exclaimed Susan. Davy replied, "Susan, you're no fun." "Well, are we going to stand around all day, or are we going to get that wooden box or chest out of the sand?" replied Tim. Tim and Brian kept digging and finally cleared enough sand away from the chest to wrap a rope around it and pull it out of the sand. They all stood in amazement at what they were about to discover. They all knew they would be rich if there was treasure in that chest. "Don't stand there, Tim. Open the damn chest." "Isn't that why we went sailing through rough seas? To find treasure?" said Brian with an anxious look on his face. Tim knelt in front of the chest and pulled out his bowie knife to pry the lock of the chest. Tim broke the lock off slowly. The chest, and there it was. There it was. Gold doubloons, enough to make every single one of them filthy rich. Tim said with excitement, "Look, there's a note." "What does it say?" asked Brian. "It says, 'Whoever takes me treasure will die at the hands of Captain Pegleg and ye, crewmatey,'" said Tim. Tim just wadded up the note and threw it in the sand. Everyone knelt in the sand next to the treasure chest, dipping their hands inside, examining the coins. Everyone was excited to see the dream of finding a real pirate's treasure chest had come true. Little did they know that their easy find would turn into their worst nightmare. Tim, Brian and Davy went back to the lifeboat with the treasure placed in the boat for safekeeping. The treasure hunters decided they would leave the island by nightfall, cash in their treasure the next morning. Captain Pegleg and his men, they were not going to let the treasure hunters get away with their treasure. Nightfall came. The captain, Brian, Tim, Davy and Susan were roasting marshmallows over the campfire. Davy told everyone to be quiet because he thought he heard something. Everyone just laughed, and Susan said, "Why don't we open this bottle of wine and celebrate our great find?" Brian opened the bottle of wine and passed the bottle around to everyone. And as Tim took a drink, there stood in front of their campfire Captain Pegleg and his men, ready to take back their treasure and kill everyone responsible for stealing it. Ye mates, me men, were I in here to claim me treasure, said Captain Pegleg. Brian rushed one of the pirates and wrestled him to the ground, stabbed him in the chest. The pirate said, "Ye fool," and pulled the knife out of his chest and rammed the blade into Brian's chest. Susan was screaming blue murder. The pirate turned Brian onto his back, and Susan came running over in hopes he was still alive. She cradled Brian in her arms, shouting, "You killed him! You killed him!" Captain Pegleg came over to Susan and told her, "He should have done what me notes said, but you stole me treasure. Now you must pay for stealing a pirate's treasure." Captain Pegleg grabbed Susan by the hair as she was begging for the captain not to harm her. The captain placed both hands on the side of her head, and with one quick twist, Susan's head was off her shoulders. Davidson and Captain Johnny Edwards tried to fight off the ghost pirates, but Captain Pegleg and his men were able to kill Captain Johnny Edwards and his men by just slitting their throats. To make sure that if any curious treasure hunters tried to steal Captain Pegleg's treasure, his men placed Captain Johnny Edwards, Susan, David, Brian and Tim's head on top of where Captain Pegleg's treasure was buried with a note that read, "If anyone dares dig up my treasure will end up like these poor souls who thought they could get away with Captain Pegleg's treasure." Captain Pegleg and his men set Captain Johnny Edwards' ship and his lifeboat out to sea. Captain Pegleg and his men were never heard from again until the next unfortunate soul or souls comes along and digs up the captain's treasure chest. If they do, they too will meet a regrettable death, such as Captain Johnny Edwards and his treasure hunters did. The end. Now that's very interesting to me, and I'm going to tell you why. When I was younger, at school, we went on a trip. Schools often did trips where you would all go together, you know. And we went to Scout Dyke. I don't know if it's still done anymore like it is, but... So in Scout Dyke, it was separated. There was boys' dormitories and there was girls' dormitories. And on the beds, because the beds were like, they were wooden and they had like mattress on because they were dorms, you know. And on the beds, because they were wooden, there was lots of things scribbled that Captain Pegleg was like a real ghost, like a real pirate ghost, and that he haunted the area. And we had a lot of fun with that because, you know, there were people that claimed to have seen him, and there were stories about it, and it was just crazy, honestly. It was so crazy, but that's what really caught my eye, Captain Pegleg, because I remember from school there was a myth. There was this Captain Pegleg. It was called Pegleg because one of his legs was a peg. You know, it was a table, sort of, you know, like a wooden table leg that they called it a peg leg. And he'd lost it due to a shark taking half of his leg off. So half of his leg was a peg leg. But yeah, it's interesting that story's there, and I remember that happening as a child, being at Scout Dyke and everybody talking about the legend of the ghost of Pegleg. Yeah, kind of reminded me of that, I guess, which is quite funny, but yeah. Thank you for listening to this story. The next story is called Death of a Writer, still by Drag Von Stoller. Daniel always dreamed of being an aspiring author that would make him the envy of every horror fiction writer. Daniel was an avid horror reader and knew every character in his books. Daniel loved to show off to his friends about how much he knew about the characters he read about in his writings. Daniel's life was about to change very soon. Daniel liked to read his horror books down in the family crypt. Daniel would say to himself, "If I'm going to be a famous author, what better place for me to be inspired? The family crypt." Daniel would spend hours down in the family crypt reading book after book until his eyes were too heavy to see what he was reading. One night, when the wind was blowing and the trees were swaying back and forth, Daniel felt inspired and told his parents that he wanted to spend the night in the family crypt. Daniel's parents weren't big horror fans, but if Daniel feels that spending the night in the family crypt will inspire him to write, so be it. Daniel thanked his parents for being so understanding. Daniel packed himself some food and a lantern and a sleeping pack, so of course he would be comfortable during the night. Daniel's father walked with him to the family crypt so he could make sure Daniel was safe. "If you need anything, just call on your cell phone," said Daniel's father. "Don't worry, father, I'll be all right. It's only for a night," said Daniel. "See you in the morning," said his father. "Good night, father," said Daniel. Daniel's father locked the door to the family crypt and went back to the house to get some rest for the night. Daniel said to himself, "This place looks a little creepy. I hope no one comes out to get me while I'm sleeping." Daniel put his sleeping bag on the floor, sat down, opened up his favourite section of horror stories, 31 Horrifying Tales from the Dead by author Dracula von Stoller. As Daniel was reading one of the stories called Necronomicon, a light was peering underneath one of the doors in the crypt. Daniel said, "I was getting into this story. I guess I'll put it down and see what that light is in that room all about." Daniel got up off the floor and cautiously approached the door and took a deep breath and slowly turned the doorknob. The door made a creaking noise as he slowly opened the door. Daniel stepped inside the room and didn't notice anything strange right off until he started to turn around and head back into the family crypt. There was a strange-looking book that had just fallen off the bookcase. Daniel went over and picked the book off the floor. "What a strange book," said Daniel. He clutched the book in his hands and blew off the dust from the cover. The more the book rested in Daniel's hands, the more the book felt as though it was coming alive. The book was getting hot, so Daniel dropped the book on the floor, which made him a little fearful of the book's power. As Daniel started walking towards the door, he noticed the door was not getting any closer. Daniel began to run faster and faster as his heart was pounding out of his chest. "It's no use," said Daniel. "No matter how hard I try to reach the door, my hand can't reach the doorknob." Daniel stopped running and bent over, clutching his knees, trying his best to catch his breath. Daniel turned towards the book and noticed it was glowing bright red and orange, as though the writing was on fire. "Well, since I'm not getting anywhere, I might as well see what this book is all about." Daniel picked the book off the floor and noticed a pentagram on the front cover of it. "What a strange-looking book," said Daniel. Daniel slowly turned page after page in the book, but there was no writing in the book. Daniel was about to close the book and put it back on the shelf when a black pen with a pentagram etched on the barrel of the pen fell to the floor. Daniel picked the pen off the floor and looked the pen over and put two and two together. "This book and pen is going to make my stories come to life on paper. Then I'll be more famous than my favourite author, Dracula von Stoller." Daniel couldn't wait to get into his sleeping bag and start writing a horror story. Daniel's dream of being a famous author was only a dream. They would die alone, die in his pen strokes. Daniel opened the book to the first blank page and started writing for hours. Daniel said, "This is a piece of cake. It won't be long before everyone is saying Drac who?" Daniel had no idea that every pen stroke was draining the life out of him. He was too high on writing that he didn't even notice he was slowly dying. Morning finally arrived. Daniel's father came down to the family crypt to see how Daniel's night of writing went. Daniel's father unlocked the door to the vault and sat beside Daniel, who was still writing like he'd accomplished what he set out to do. Daniel said, "Look, father, I've written some of the best horror stories ever written. Not even Drac von Stoller could have written such a masterpiece as I have written." Daniel's father said, "Do you mind if I read some of your stories?" "Not at all, be my guest," said Daniel. Daniel's father turned to page 1, but there was nothing on the page. So he kept turning the pages, but they were all empty. Daniel, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there are no stories in this book. I think you need to come outside and get some fresh air and some breakfast. Daniel grabbed the book out of his father's hands. Let me see myself. When Daniel turned the pages, his stories were all there. But only Daniel could see them, not anyone else. Is this some trick, father? Said Daniel. No, son, I don't see any stories you claim you wrote. Why don't you put the book down and come back to the house for some breakfast, so you can write stories in your warm bedroom? No, I'm not ready yet. Leave. I'm working on my last story. Guess what it's called, said Daniel. Let me guess. How about the tarantula? Laughed Daniel's father. No, silly. It's the death of a writer, said Daniel, smiling. Just give me one more night and I'll come home, said Daniel. Okay, one more night and that's it. Thanks, Dad, said Daniel, smiling. Daniel was so excited about his latest story. He turned the blank page and started writing away. Then all of a sudden, the door swung open, but it was no dream. It was a sorcerer coming back from the dead for the book Daniel thought was just a journal to write in. The sorcerer approached Daniel and said, Why have you stolen my book? Daniel said in a nervous tone, I found it in that room behind you. I didn't know it was your book. If I would have known that, I would have put it back. That's the truth. I meant no harm. Silence. I'll be the judge of your innocence, said the sorcerer. The sorcerer grabbed the book out of Daniel's hands and started turning the pages. Every page the sorcerer turned, Daniel's writings were covering the original spells that were in the book. For this evil deed you have done, I sentence you to death by writing, said the sorcerer. Daniel pleaded for his life, but it was no use. The sorcerer never turns back on his word. The sorcerer pulled out the wand and cast a spell on Daniel that would cause him to write non-stop until his heart stopped beating. The next morning, Daniel's father came by to tell Daniel to wrap his writing and come home. But there was no answer. Daniel's father pulled back the top of the sleeping bag that was covering Daniel's head and was shocked at what he saw. Daniel's tips of his fingers were bloody from writing non-stop, and the look on his face was of fear. Daniel's father took the book from Daniel's hands and turned the first page. And all that was in the book was the title of his last writing, The Death of the Writer. Daniel's father called the police to investigate what might have happened to Daniel that caused his death, but they couldn't find an explanation. So the death of the writer, sell millions of copies and become the famous author he always dreamed he would be one day. The end. And that's the end of our 3 stories by Drac von Stoller. Thank you so much for listening to them, and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to some more stories by Drac von Stoller. This story is called Evil. Reverend Jesse West and his family reside in a town called Jacksport for the past 30 years. The Reverend's wife taught Bible school to young children at her husband's church, while he vowed all the members of the church. The Reverend knew his Bible inside and out and always helped anyone in need. Money was pouring in every Sunday, and things were looking suitable for the West family. But the Reverend West had a dark side nobody knew about, not even his wife. The well-respected Reverend of Jacksport had a love for blood. He thought drinking the blood from his victims brought him closer to God. He was able to hide his dirty little secret and always cover his tracks. The money that was taken up for the collection went mainly to build the Reverend and his family a mansion with a secret room where his victims were led to thirst his quench for blood. The Reverend was able to keep his secret hidden until he forgot to lock his soundproof room, and his wife opened the door and caught him in the act. She was very angry. What in the hell are you doing to that girl? Her whole world was shattered. Seeing the man she thought was like a god to her turned out to be the evilest man she ever met. Her husband turned around as blood was dripping down his chin and said, Honey, I'm only doing this to get closer to God. You're sick. You're sick. I want a divorce, said Mrs. West. You're not getting a divorce from me, replied her husband. Watch me. You are disgusting, answered his wife. More heated words were exchanged, and his wife ran out of the room, telling him she was calling the police. Oh, no, you're not, said her husband in a stern voice. Right as she was dialing 911, he grabbed the receiver out of her hand and started beating her over the head with the receiver so hard he cracked her skull and broke the receiver. He yanked the cell phone cord out of the wall and slammed the phone on the floor, shattering it into a million pieces. He was pissed that his wife walked in on him and spoiled his dirty little secret. The Reverend dragged her barely conscious body to his secret room to drink blood, and he was about to cut her jugular vein and fill his cup with her blood. She said in a low tone of voice, I hope you rot in hell for what sins you have done. Then she slumped over, dead in the chair. The Reverend proceeded, cutting the jugular vein, as though his wife's death had no meaning. About a couple of Sundays later, no word why the Reverend's wife was a no-show in church and Sunday school. Some of the members were smelling foul play and decided to confront the Reverend about his wife's whereabouts. He told them she was visiting relatives out of country and won't be back until next month. They had a lot of respect for the Reverend, so they took his word and let it go. The Reverend decided next Sunday he would make up a story that his wife got robbed and needed money to get back home. The congregation again bought his story, pulled out their wallets. The Reverend knew it was time to pack his bags and get out of the country before his dirty little secret got out around town. The Reverend got plane tickets, boarded a plane in hopes of starting a new life, leaving his dirty little secret behind. Just as he sat down in his seat on the flight, the police boarded the plane and arrested him. After searching the mansion from top to bottom, pictures of his victims were found in a wall safe. The more the police dug into the Reverend's private life, the secret got even dirtier and more disgusting. His wife wasn't the only murder he committed. Another scrapbook found in a locked desk in the Reverend's study had at least 50 more victims. In each picture, he posed with his victim tied to a chair or bed with terror on their faces that showed him drinking their blood from a glass. Many of the photos were at least 30 years old. When the death sentence was handed down, the judge asked the Reverend if he had anything he wanted to say to the family of the victims, and he said, You've only scratched the surface of my killings. There were hundreds more. The bulk of my victims were runaways and prostitutes. Keep on digging. Go ahead and flick the switch. I'm ready to pay for my sins. And one more thing. Their blood was so warm and tasty. The Reverend was handcuffed and taken to death row to await the day of execution. The day finally arrived for the Reverend to die, and the families of the victims were rejoicing. It was midnight, and the pastor asked the Reverend who would like to say any last words, and he said, You should have been there to taste their warm blood and hear their pleas. The guards placed the Reverend in an electric chair and strapped him in, and the Reverend said, Are you ready to smell some burning flesh? The switch was thrown. 10,000 volts travelled through the top of his head down to his feet. The switch had to be thrown a second time for this evil man to die. In the quiet town of Jacksport, a chilling tale of horror unfolded after Reverend Jesse West returned from the dead. His execution by electric chair for over 50 gruesome murders had been thought to be the end of the reign of terror, but it turned out to be just the beginning. The town's peaceful atmosphere was shattered as his vengeful ghost emerged, haunting the once serene streets. For weeks, the spectre of Reverend West wreaked havoc upon Jacksport. His ghastly presence was felt by all, as eerie whispers filled the air and shadows danced with malevolent intent. Fear and paranoia gripped the townspeople, rendering them prisoners in their own homes, afraid to venture out after dark. The once close-knit community was now divided by suspicion and terror. Amidst the chaos, word of supernatural turmoil reached the ears of Father Gabriel, a steadfast Catholic priest, known for his unwavering faith and determination. Father Gabriel felt compelled to confront the malevolent spirit and bring peace back to the town. Armed with ancient texts, blessed artifacts, and an unshakable resolve, he set out to banish the vengeful spirit of Reverend West once and for all. As Father Gabriel delved into the arcane knowledge of exorcism and spiritual warfare, he discovered the true extent of the darkness that had consumed Reverend West's soul. The evil deeds he had committed in life had bound him to this world, allowing his malevolence to persist even beyond death. Armed with this understanding, Father Gabriel prepared himself for a battle that would test his faith and courage. On the night of the final confrontation, the moon cast an eerie glow over the town as Father Gabriel stood before the ethereal form of Reverend West. The ghostly figure exuded a chilling aura, its eyes filled with hatred that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. With unwavering determination, Father Gabriel recited ancient incantations, brandishing a cross and holy water. The struggle between light and darkness intensified as the two forces clashed in a battle that transcended the mortal realm. The air crackled with energy, the very ground beneath them trembled with the weight of their conflict. In a climactic moment, Father Gabriel summoned his deepest reserves of faith and unleashed a powerful prayer that reverberated through the night. The force of his conviction, bolstered by the prayers of the terrified townspeople who had gathered nearby, proved to be the catalyst that shattered the grip of Reverend West's malevolence. With an howl of anguish, the ghostly figure of Reverend West was engulfed in blinding light. His form contorted and twisted, writhing in agony as Father Gabriel's exorcism took hold. As the light intensified, the ground seemed to open up beneath the ghostly figure, and with a final scream, Reverend West was banished to the depths of hell. His reign of terror finally brought to an end. The town of Jackspot slowly began to heal after the departure of the malevolent spirit. Father Gabriel's unwavering faith and courage had saved the town from its darkest nightmare. The community united once again, stronger than before, determined to rebuild and reclaim their peaceful way of life. And so, the tale of Reverend Jesse West's sinister's return and subsequent banishment became a cautionary legend in Jacksport, a reminder that even in the face of the most unimaginable horrors, the power of faith and courage can triumph over the forces of darkness. The end. I like that story. It's a very wonderful story indeed. The next story is called Flesh Ripper by Drak von Stoller. Things down at the new Japanese massage parlour called The Rub were about to become a little messy because the customers leaving without paying their bill, making up excuses that they'll pay their next visit. That was about to change because there was a new masseuse named Lamia, meaning Demon of the Pit, was summoned up to make these non-paying customers, well, pay with their flesh. The Rub was losing too much money and was on the verge of being shut down for good. Lamia, the Demon of the Pit, wasn't going to let that happen. One of the Rub's most frequent non-paying customers was Gerald Tucker, who stood 6'3", and all the masseuses didn't dare cross him because of his mean temper and his violent tendencies towards them. Mr. Tucker was in for a big surprise this time, because Lamia was going to give him the massage of death. This time Mr. Tucker was going to be put in his place for good. No money would get this cheapskate out of trouble this time. Mr. Tucker was greeted by the receptionist with a big smile and told him he was going to get the best rub they had to offer. Mr. Tucker entered the dimly lit room for his massage. Lamia was ready and patiently waiting for Mr. Tucker's arrival. Mr. Tucker introduced himself and Lamia said, "Good afternoon. Why don't you take your coat and shirt off, lie on your stomach, I'll be with you in just a moment. Lamia came back to the massage table and said, I heard you've never paid for a massage. I don't have to pay for anything. I own this town. Now, why don't you shut your mouth and start massaging? Or I'll, replied Mr. Tucker. You'll what? Asked Lamia, as she was slowly transforming into the demon she was. Mr. Tucker said, in a stern voice, What the hell in God's name are you? I'm the demon of Pit. I've been summoned up from the pit to take care of pathetic pieces of crap like you, answered Lamia. Mr. Tucker rose up from the table and shouted, Is this some joke? Lamia raised her hands. They were razor-sharp fingernails, over 2 inches long. They appeared out of nowhere and put deep gashes into Mr. Tucker's face. Mr. Tucker was begging and pleading for his life, but Lamia just let out a demonic roar and started massaging Mr. Tucker with her razor-sharp nails, peeling away his flesh as his screams and agonizing pain echoed throughout the massage parlor. All the money in the world couldn't save the cheapskate in the end. So Mr. Tucker just lay there on the massage table in agonizing pain as Lamia just kept on digging deeper and deeper into his flesh until his heart stopped beating. Lamia then carried his blood-soaked body down to the basement of the massage parlor for a blood-thirsty, flesh-eating demon, dogs to belly, full of his bones and flesh. Lamia said to the demon dogs, There is plenty more where that came from, I can assure you. The demon dogs pointed their heads up and howled, letting Lamia know they were thankful for the tasty meal she had brought them. Lamia smiled and headed back upstairs to the parlour to let the owner know the deed was done, and if any more non-paying customers leave, she would have to be summoned up, and she'd gladly return to wait for the next summoning. A lesson to be learned. If you don't pay up, you might get a visit from Lamia, the demon of the pit, and have to pay with your flesh, just like the cheapskate Mr. Tucker did at the rub. The end. Well, that's definitely an interesting story indeed. I've not quite heard one like that. I do like the idea of Lamia though. What do you think, guys? Definitely interesting indeed. It's different for sure. But I'd love to know your thoughts on it. Because, like I say, I do like these stories. I like Drac von Stoller. So yeah. We'll move on to the next story from Drac von Stoller, and that is In the Forests of the Night. Deep in the forest stands a mountain known as Death Mountain that has claimed the lives of many daring mountain climbers. It's one of the tallest mountains in the world, at approximately a height of 32,000 feet. The reason that so many climbers have lost their lives is because of health issues and freezing temperatures. You can always count on an avalanche to be waiting for the next brave souls to risk their lives climbing to the top of the Death Mountain. Not only is the mountain covered with mounds of snow, but there's also a hint of sunlight to light the climbers way as they climb the treacherous journey to the peak of the mountain. Of course, there's always some botshot climbers that think they are the ones that will be the first to stand at the top of Death Mountain and yell out, "We made it," and congratulate the rest of the brave climbers for such a heroic feat. Here's where the story begins. Jimmy Spencer and his friends, Karen, Jackie and Tom, they're all avid mountain climbers. They're always up for a challenge. They all dreamed of being heroes in their town. There wasn't much excitement in their village. So if Jimmy and his friends could climb the highest mountain and survive to tell about it, they would all be heroes. The farthest anyone climbed was halfway because of avalanches and extreme cold temperatures. It was too dangerous for helicopters or planes to fly above Death Mountain to search for lost climbers, so any search was by foot. Jimmy and his mountain climbing buddies were used to extreme temperatures, so they all thought if anybody could tackle such a feat, it would be their team of climbers to do it. Jimmy, Karen, Jackie and Tom decided they would spend the night at Jimmy's cabin, which was about 20 miles from Death Mountain. In the morning, they would stop by for breakfast at Dave's Diner and discuss their history-making feat on Death Mountain. Everyone piled in Jimmy's van and set off down the road to Jimmy's cabin to let their egos explode about how they were going to be famous in a couple of weeks. The only fame these four mountain climbers would be getting is being splashed all over the major newspapers across the nation about their mysterious deaths. As Jimmy was pulling into the gravel driveway to his cabin, the snow was coming down pretty heavy. But Karen did say, "I can't dream come true. Since we've all been climbing mountains for over 10 years, Death Mountain is going to make us famous." Tom replied, "I've never been so happy to be with the best climbers and friends. This should be a breeze for all of us." "Okay, everyone, we're here, and we all know the drill. No alcohol, no staying up late because we have the toughest days ahead of us. My watch says 7 p.m., and I want us all in bed by 9 p.m. and up by 6 a.m. for breakfast," explained Jimmy. "Well, we have 2 hours before we hit the sack. Does anyone want to play some poker?" asked Tom. Karen answered, "That sounds like a good idea to pass the time." "I'm game," said Jackie. Jimmy chimed in and said, "I'll get the fire started. You can count me in." Everyone sat at the table and the cards were passed out. As the game progressed, Karen asked Jimmy, "You think we can reach the top of Death Mountain alive to tell about it?" "If I had any doubt about our abilities, we wouldn't be here right now planning the great moment in history," replied Jimmy. Tom chimed in and said, "Look, guys, it's about time to call it tonight. I have to agree with Jimmy. We were all brought here for a reason, and that reason is to be the first team of climbers to reach the top of Death Mountain and come back as heroes. So, Karen, don't worry. We're in the company of some of the best mountain climbers, and I guarantee we're all coming back in one piece." "Sorry, everybody. I just get a little nervous because no one has ever been able to come back and celebrate such a feat," explained Karen. "Okay, I think it's time to wrap up this poker game and get some sleep, because our toughest days are ahead of us," explained Jimmy. Everyone got up from the table, headed to bed, dreaming of their history-making days ahead of them. Morning finally arrived. The alarm sounded. Jimmy grabbed the alarm clock off the nightstand and turned it off. Jimmy got out of bed and walked over to wake up the climbing buddies. "Get up, everybody. It's time for breakfast." They all got up, showered, got their supplies together for the climb to the Death Mountain. After their showers, Jimmy went through the checklist to make sure they had their gear packed. Then they put on their heavy coats and piled into Jimmy's van and headed to Dave's Diner for breakfast. After breakfast, Jimmy told everyone to hold hands. Then Jimmy said a little prayer before they got up from the table and headed out of Dave's Diner to Death Mountain. Finally, Jimmy pulled his van into Death Mountain, and its beauty overtook everyone. But we all know beauty's only skin deep. Jimmy said, "Okay, everybody, let's get this party started." Everyone got out of the van and loaded their gear and started their climb up Death Mountain. The snow was pretty intense, and they were ascending the mountain. Jimmy turned around and said, "Since the snow is putting a damper on our ascending, I think we should set up camp in a couple of hours. That way we can at least get 5,000 feet behind us. Then in morning, if the snow lets up, we can edge our way up the mountain before we set to climb again. And then we can camp." Everyone agreed and proceeded forward with the climb. Karen chimed in and said, "I can see why they call this mountain Death Mountain." Then all of a sudden, Karen screamed out, "Jackie, hold on!" Karen, Tom and Jimmy rushed to Jackie's aid as she was clinging to dear life on the edge of the mountain. Tommy and Jimmy grabbed hold of Jackie's arm, and Karen wrapped a rope underneath Jackie's arms as a precaution in case Tom or Jimmy lost their footing on the edge of the mountain. Luckily with Jackie's friends, quick thinking, her life was saved. Jackie thanked her friends, and they all hugged and pressed forward. Finally, Jimmy and his friends reached their first destination and set up camp for the night. Jimmy and Tom got the tent set up. Jackie and Karen gathered firewood to build a fire to give them some warmth at least for the night. The first night was a breeze, But night 2 would keep these 4 climbers sleeping with one eye open. Strange noises were echoing in the distance, and their tent started shaking violently, causing panic inside the shelter of not knowing what lurks outside of their tent. Karen and Jackie were clinging to Jimmy and Tom for dear life, screaming as the tent was shaking. Then silence. Tom and Jimmy told the girls to stay inside the tent. They would try to find out what caused the tent to shake. But as Tom and Jimmy searched for at least an hour, they couldn't find a single clue of what caused the tent to shake, not even so much as a footprint in the snow. Tom and Jimmy went back to their tent shaking their heads at what just happened, with no explanation to ease the girls' minds. As Jimmy unzipped the tent, Jackie and Karen sat up waiting for the news, but there was no good news. "I'm sorry, but Tom and I canvassed the whole area and could not find a single footprint or animal tracks leading to the tent. I'm just going to assume it was a gust of wind that caused the tent to shake." "That was no gust of wind, I tell you. We've all camped in many tents throughout the years, and I know what wind can do to a tent. And someone or something shook our tent to scare us." Jackie chimed in and said, "Sorry guys, that explanation, it doesn't hold water. But I thank you for trying to ease our minds. Maybe whatever it is won't be back, and in the morning we can press forward to climb far enough away that this thing won't be back. I suggest we try and get some sleep, because we have another long day ahead of us." Everyone did their best to get a good night's rest, but that was going to be difficult because of the fear of whatever was out there. It could probably be back. This time their lives would be in jeopardy. All they heard through the night was strange noises echoing through the forest. When morning finally arrived, the 4 climbers sat around the campfire eating breakfast and discussing what might have been the cause of the violent tent shaking. Maybe it was a bear. "I've heard legends about Bigfoot sightings on Death Mountain," said Jackie. Jimmy laughed and said, "Bigfoot? You gotta be kidding me. I was thinking more of alien intervention." "Karen, what do you think?" asked Sam. "I think it was some jealous climbers that don't want us to make history. That's what I think," answered Karen. "You know what, Karen? Your answer makes more sense than any of ours," said Jimmy. Everyone started laughing and saying, "We're just making something out of nothing." After breakfast, everyone hiked to the second campsite, and over 5,000 feet up the mountain. The further these climbers got up the mountain, the closer they came to death. Again, another climber lost their footing and came inches from falling to their death. But luck was on their side. Their success would be running out as soon as they reached the third campsite, which would put the climbers at 15,000 feet. Finally, the climbers reached the third campsite as the snow was letting up. Jimmy said to the others, "We're about halfway to the top, but there's some heavy snow headed our way tonight. And that's going to set us back a couple of days." Karen said, "That's okay by me. I could sure use the rest." Tom and Jackie both agreed. The 4 climbers got their tent set up and got a fire started for the night of terror. Everyone gathered around the fire to keep warm. Karen said, "Did you hear that? Guys, did you hear that?" "Hear what?" replied Jackie. "Sounded like a faint growl," said Karen. "Stop kidding around. You know how scared we got the first campsite. We don't need any distractions," exclaimed Jackie. "Sorry, I was just having a bit of fun," replied Karen. Jimmy said, "This calls for a little celebration." Jimmy pulled out a bottle of wine from inside his coat and popped the top, took a swig and passed the bottle around until the bottle was dry. Do you realize that we're so close to getting to the top of Death Mountain?" Everyone yelled out, "Hell yeah. We're going to be the envy of every mountain climber when we get down from this mountain next week," exclaimed Jimmy. "I think we should all get a good night's rest, because there were a lot of celebrating and picture taking to do," said Jimmy. Everyone entered the tent for the last time. An hour passed. Everyone was fast asleep. Then all of a sudden, blood-curdling screams echoed throughout Death Mountain from the 4 climbers, and then silence. The following week, the media was waiting patiently for hours with the anticipation of being the first to interview and take pictures of the history-making climbers. but that would not be the case. A search party came. When the 4 climbers were found, the searchers got the shock of their lives. There were no sign of blood, or any blood around the area, around their bodies. Their eyes were missing. The bodies were charred, but there were no signs of fire near the bodies. After further investigations by the local authorities and coroner's office, traces of radiation on their bodies and their skin was that of a person that was at least over 80 years old. Their hair was white. Something else didn't add up. That was, whatever happened must have been horrifying, because their tent had been cut open from the inside. There were assumptions made by many of the townspeople saying they were part of an alien abduction that went wrong, and the aliens just tossed their lifeless bodies out of their spaceship like rag dolls when they were through with their experiment. Another assumption was that the climbers stumbled upon top-secret military research, and the military had killed them. Who knows what happened to these 4 mountain climbers on Death Mountain? The 4 climbers were so close yet so far away from making their record-breaking climb. But I guess we'll never know what happened to these climbers on Death Mountain. The end. Now, that really is an interesting story. That one. But it kind of does sort of remind us of the Dyatlov Pass mystery, doesn't it? I think it's taken from that, really, and just rewrote in another way. If you don't know what that is, then research it. It's pretty horrific. Dyatlov Pass. It really happened, and it's awful. So yeah, but anyway, that's the next 3 stories from Drac von Stoller. Thank you for listening, and many blessings. Wisteria, energy, twister. Wisteria, energy, twister. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the Drac von Stoller collection. This story is called It Was Just an Accident. Susie Edwards found out at an early age how looks can be an advantage if you do something wrong. It all started with small things like the family pet. One day when Susan was out walking the dog, she wanted to see if she could get away with killing the dog. Susie took the dog to the edge of the cliff, deep within the woods, in the back of her house, threw a stick, told the dog to fetch. The dog did as asked and went over the edge of the cliff to its death. Susie thought this was cool, but she didn't realize killing things isn't such a cool thing to do. Susie was such a likable person. She had many friends, but she was getting pretty bored with their company and never forgot about the rush she got when she watched a dog run off the edge of the cliff to its death. Susie was ready to test the waters of death on her friends. She invited 3 of her closest friends over for a sleepover. She asked Brenda, Susan and Jamie, and they said, of course, sure thing. Susie's adrenaline was pumping through her veins. She was working hard on planning her friends' last night on Earth. Finally, night had arrived. Susie greeted her friends at the door and wanted to make sure they were comfortable before the killing began. Susie came up to Brenda and said, Brenda, come with me. I want to show you something. Susie told Jamie and Susan they would be right back, and they would watch a movie. The 2 girls sat down on the couch and started to watch TV, while Susie and Brenda went outside for a walk. Susie told Brenda to walk with her through the woods. Brenda followed her to a tree that was about 10 feet from the edge of the cliff. Susie had a piñata hanging from the tree and told Brenda if she broke the piñata, she would get the jewelry inside of it. Susie placed a blindfold over Brenda's eyes and spun her around, then guided her in the direction of the cliff and pushed her off the edge. As Brenda was falling, Susie just laughed as she screamed for help. After watching her friend plummet to her death, she just laughed and skipped along through the woods back to her house to plan the next killing. Susie knew she had to act fast, so she went straight to the kitchen and poured Jamie and Susan a drink laced with rat poison. Susie didn't quite put enough rat poison in it, which only made the two girls lightheaded. The girls asked where Brenda was, and Susie said, as she was crying, she lost her balance and fell off the cliff. I swear it was just an accident. Susan said, is she still alive? I'm not sure, replied Susie. All three girls headed into the woods to the cliff. But just as they were walking out the door to the woods, Susie picked up a baseball bat, kept it hidden behind her back. So when they reached the cliff, she would hit the girls in the head with enough force to cause them to lose their balance and fall to their deaths, just as Brenda had. Both girls were standing next to the edge, and Susie swung the bat, striking at Susan, which cracked her skull, and Jamie screamed for help, but her screams would go unnoticed. Susie swung the bat, hitting Jamie across the head. She too went off the edge to her death. Susie was laughing hysterically, but she would have to do a lot of explaining when her parents got a knock on their door the next morning asking questions about the whereabouts of Susan, Jamie and Brenda. Morning arrived, and sure enough, the police came knocking and wanted to know if anyone might know where the three girls went when they left Susie's house. Of course, Susie was as calm as a kitten and said, I guess they went home. After the police were through asking questions, they left with no answers, but told Susie and her parents not to leave town. A week passed by. Finally, the girls' bodies were discovered by two boys playing in the woods. The police came back to Susie's house asking more questions, and Susie said to the officers, we were playing at the edge of the cliff. We all lost our balance because a piece of the ground gave way. Brenda pushed me backwards towards the edge, and I was able to hang onto the side and pull myself back up to safety. I wish I could have saved them all, but I couldn't. Susie was saying all this as fake tears were rolling down her cheeks. The three girls' bodies were recovered, and the skeletal remains of Susie's dog. The three girls' deaths were all ruled as an accident. Susie was so happy. She was ready for some more killing. The body count started piling up, and this time, too many fingers were being pointed at Susie to say it was just an accident. After the three girls' deaths were forgotten, Susie was ready for some more action. This time she decided to invite Doug, Johnny, and Debbie over to camp out in the woods behind her house. As they were setting up the tent, Susie asked Doug if he would go get some firewood, but she told him exactly where to find some, and Susie dug a pit, filled it full of snakes, placed loose branches over it so that it wouldn't look suspicious. Doug ran over to where Susie had told him to go, and Doug fell right into the snake pit and was bitten all over his body. Johnny and Debbie tried their best to free Doug, but it was no use. Susie was laughing under her breath. Johnny and Debbie said, what are we going to do? Susan replied, don't worry, you both stay right here. Don't let Doug out of your sight. I'll go call the police. Johnny and Debbie did as Susie asked, but Susie had no intentions of calling the police. All Susie was thinking about was killing Johnny and Debbie, so they couldn't go to the police, even though it looked like an accident. Susie grabbed a shotgun from her father's gun cabinet, loaded it, and set off back in the woods to blow Johnny and Debbie's heads off. Susie slowly crept up on Debbie and Johnny as their backs were turned, raised the shotgun, and shot Johnny in the back of the head. He fell in the snake pit dead. Debbie started screaming and running for her life, but Susie was so pumped up, she wasn't going to let Debbie get out of the woods alive. Just as Debbie thought she was home free, Susie jumped right in front of her and pushed her to the ground. Debbie kept screaming, but the nearest house was half a mile down the road, so her screams went unnoticed. Susie said, "Shut up, this'll all be over in a few seconds." Debbie was crying and pleading for her life. Susie pumped the shotgun, started laughing and said, "This is the only thing I do best in life, and that is kill people." "You're sick," replied Debbie. "I think it's time I shut your mouth for good." And Susie said this as she pointed the barrel at Debbie's head. Susie pulled the trigger, and Susie's head was blown clean off her shoulders. Susie had this all planned out to a T. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, so what a perfect time for Susie to kill some more of her friends. Susie didn't realize a passing motorist heard her gunshots. The driver stopped their vehicle, turned their lights off, and got out their cell phone and called the police. Susie tossed the shotgun in the snake pit and headed back home, but she didn't make it home because the police stopped and questioned her. But Susie took off running home. The officer chased her down and tackled her. The officer asked her, "Why did you take off running when I asked you a question?" Susie replied, "It was an accident. It was just an accident." And she started crying. The officer said, "What are you talking about?" "We were camping out, and Doug was drinking too much and went back to his truck and got a shotgun and came back and started shooting everybody. And that's when I started running for my life. I just wanted to go home," said a teary-eyed Susan. Susie knew if she went back to the scene of the crime and tried to explain what happened, the officer would never believe her story. As they were walking through the woods, the officer called for backup. And as the officer was distracted, talking to another officer in the walkie-talkie, Susie's killer instinct kicked in. She grabbed his gun out of his holster and opened fire on the officer, killing him. Susie was in so deep now that no jury would let her off. Susie grabbed the officer by his ankles and dragged his body to the snake pit. And the officer grabbed Susan by the ankle, and she tried to get free, but he had a tight grip. So she shot him 5 times. Then he released his grip. Susie wasn't laughing anymore. She was in panic mode. Then she pushed his body into the snake pit along with Johnny, Doug and Debbie's bodies, then covered the hole with branches. Susie hightailed it out of the woods, but 3 squad cars were blocking her escape route. The officers had their guns drawn, and Susie opened fire on them, and the officers returned fire, wounding her. Susie was handcuffed and taken down to headquarters for further questioning, as the officers searched for the other officer that called in for the backup. After further investigation and all 4 bodies had been collected and autopsies done, it was apparent homicide was the cause of death. Susie kept to her story about all their deaths being accidents, but the police interrogator wasn't buying her story. Susie's fingerprints were all over the shotgun, and the police decided to dig a little deeper into Susie's past. Discovered 3 of her closest friends died while she was present. Brenda, Jamie and Susan's bodies, they had to be exhumed to see what caused their death for sure. And so was found. It was blunt force trauma to Jamie and Susan's head, traces of rat poison in their bloodstream. But couldn't find any evidence that Susie was the cause of Brenda's death. In the end, Susie was convicted of murder in the first degree of Jamie, Susan, Johnny, Debbie, Doug, and the police officer, and second degree murder for the death of Brenda. Susie was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It wasn't even a month that Susie spent in jail that she decided to end her life because she could no longer be free in the outside world to kill again. She hung herself in a jail cell. All the pain that Susie caused the family of the murdered victims was finally over now that the psycho killer ended her own life. The end. Well, that's definitely a bit macabre, that, isn't it? Imagine having a friend like that. No, thank you. Thanks for listening to this story, though, and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the Drac von Stoller collection. This one is called When Death Comes Knocking. That's the story anyway. That's what it's called. We all know if you hear a knock on your door, you're supposed to ask who it is. Maybe look through the people before you turn the doorknob to let who or, I don't know, whatever it is inside. Somehow the people in a little town called Spritsville were in for an evil surprise. Tom and Kathy Matheson never got along with anyone in the village because their beliefs were not of what the town stood for. Tom and Kathy dressed in black, head to toe, while everyone else wore expensive clothing and lived the Spritsville life to a T. Tom and Kathy could barely hold down a job because of being put down by their fellow employees. Tom said, Kathy, you know, I'm sick and tired of being ridiculed by the way we dress and being accused of witchcraft. I think it's time we make these townspeople pay for what they've done to us. What do you think? I feel the same way. Every time I go to the hairdresser, everyone stares at me and whispers to each other. Now and then someone comes by and makes a derogatory remark. You know, it's something I'm sick of too, replied Kathy. Tom remembered the Book of the Dead that was in their bedroom and didn't feel the need to use it really until now. Tom said to Kathy, are you thinking what I'm thinking? You betcha, Kathy answered. Tom went over to the nightstand and pulled the Book of the Dead from the drawer, blew off the dust from the cover and said, let's get this party started and see if there is something in this book that can turn Spritsville into Hellsville overnight. Kathy chimed in and said, Tom, let me pick out an evil spell. Go ahead, be my guest, but make it a good one, explained Tom. Don't worry, replied Kathy. Tom, I know the perfect spell. Come look. This one says how to change into their loved one that's passed on, read Kathy. That's a good one. We can cover more ground this way if we both transform into sort of a dead relative. That way they will open the doors. And when we enter and kill them, the police will see that it wasn't forced entry. We'll think someone in their own home killed them instead of an intruder, explained Tom. Let's get on with it. I'm ready to raise some hell in this little town, explained Tom. Kathy and Tom knocked on every one of their neighbours' doors and transformed into a relative that had passed long ago. Shock and screams echoed throughout the little town of Spritsville after their dead relative changed and ended up turning up at the door. In the wake of the horrifying events on Long Hollow Pike Road, a dark cloud seemed to settle over the nearby town of Spritsville. The legends surrounding the road had taken on a new level of terror. Whispers of paranormal explorers' disappearances had reached the most remote corners of the region. As if drawn by an unseen force, the malevolent spirits of Kathy and Tom began to manifest in Spritsville itself. They knocked on the doors of their unsuspecting neighbours, taking on forms of long-deceased relatives. Shock and disbelief gripped the townspeople as they saw their loved ones standing before them, returned from the grave. However, the facade quickly crumbled as the spirits revealed their true nature. The gruesome sight of their transformation back into Kathy and Tom, followed by horrifying acts of violence. This plunged the town into a state of panic. Screams echoed through the streets of Spritsville, and the once peaceful community was now haunted by the malevolent presence of these vengeful spirits. News of the town's plight reached the ears of a renowned group of paranormal investigators known as the Spectral Wardens. These investigators had a reputation for confronting the most malevolent, most powerful entities. Upon hearing about the havoc wrought by Kathy and Tom's evil spirits, they felt compelled to intervene. The spectral wardens arrived in Spiritsville armed with ancient texts, ancient artifacts, and a determination to cleanse the town of the malevolent forces that had taken hold. Their leader, Dr. Marcus Thornwood, was a seasoned investigator with a deep understanding of dark arts, a relentless drive to protect the living from the grasp of the undead. The town had fallen into a state of dread, with its residents fearful of every knock on their door and every shadow in the night. The spectral wardens wasted no time. They conducted extensive research in the history of Kathy and Tom, seeking the source of their malevolence and their link to the living world. One night, as the moon cast an eerie glow over Spiritsville, the spectral wardens initiated a ritual to draw out the spirits. They gathered in the town square, surrounded by protective sigils and imbued artifacts. Using their knowledge of ancient incantations, they invoked the spirits of Kathy and Tom, forcing them to confront their deeds in life and the pain they had inflicted in death. The air grew heavy as the spirits manifested, their ethereal forms contorted by anger and pain. But the spectral warden stood strong, their resolve unyielding. Dr. Thornwood addressed the spirits, his voice carrying a weight that transcended the boundaries of living and the dead. "You are bound by darkness you have embraced," he proclaimed, "but your reign of terror ends here. You will find no solace in this realm. It's time to face the consequences of your actions and release your hold on the living." A fierce battle of wills ensued as the spectral wardens channeled their energy into the ritual. The spirits of Kathy and Tom writhed, their forms flickering as if caught between two worlds. The ground trembled, the air crackled with supernatural energy. Slowly, the spirits began to weaken. Their forms became transparent, their screams turned into mournful wails as the light of the dawn touched the horizon. The spirits were engulfed by a blinding light, their tormented forms dissipating into the ether. With a collective sigh of relief, the spectral wardens watched as the darkness receded, leaving behind a town no longer plagued by the malevolence and the presence of Kathy and Tom. The once haunted streets of Spiritsville began to heal, and the terror that had gripped the community gradually ebbed away. As the sun rose on a new day, the town of Spiritsville began to rebuild, its wounds slowly mending. The spectral wardens departed, leaving behind a grateful town and a newfound understanding of the power of the living to overcome even the most vengeful of spirits. And in the years that followed, the story of their intervention became a legend itself, a testament to the strength of those who dared to confront the supernatural and the resilience of communities that refused to be defined by fear. The end. That's a strange story indeed. I think it means that they actually turned into spirits because they dabbled in the dark arts, which made them become spirits. So, yeah. Thank you for listening, and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the Dark Monster collection of stories. This one is called Kill Me Dead or I'll Be Back. I'm sure you've all heard the saying. It actually did used to be back in the day. The saying was, "You better kill me, if you don't, I'll be back." Now, it's said in a better way because it said, "If you're going to kill me right, or I'll come back," basically. But back then, that's what it was in the olden times. It used to be, "You better kill me, if you don't, I'll be back." That's what Tim said to these men that were terrorizing the town. These three brothers, Dave, Tom and Jack, were the most hated in the town of Hattersfield. Somehow these brothers didn't have anything better to do, like have a job. They were always drinking heavily, getting into fights with the men in the town, because they would flirt with their women and carry it just a little too far. One day when Tim was driving home, a car pulled up right beside him, and one of the men rolled down the passenger side window and said, "Hey, Tim, you want a race?" Tim replied, "Not interested." "Are you chicken?" asked Jack, one of the passengers in Tom's car. "No." "Why don't you guys leave me alone?" exclaimed Tim. The men started laughing and calling Tim a chicken. Tom decided to play chicken with Tim, so he slowed the car down and got behind Tim's car and tapped his bumper several times. Tim started driving faster, but Tom wasn't about to let up on the chase. Tim finally lost control of his vehicle, and his car went off into the ditch and caught on fire. Tom pulled his car over, and all three men got out of the car and pulled Tim from his burning vehicle. "Thanks. I was almost a dead man," Jack said. "Did you think we pulled you out of the burning car to save your life? We only pulled you out because we're the ones that's going to whoop your ass." Tim replied, "Why?" Dave chimed in as he took a swig of beer and said, "We like terrorizing this town." Then Dave started kicking Tim in his side. Tim moaned and said, "You better kill me, or I will be back." Dave, Tom, and Jack just laughed as they popped the tops of their beer cans and beat him severely. Before Tim passed out and finally took his last breath, he said, "I'll be back. Mark my words." Jack said, "I've heard enough." I went over to Tom's trunk and got out a crowbar, walked up to Tim, and started bashing his skull in as Tom and Dave laughed, finishing off their beers. When they were through killing Tim, they tossed his body on top of his burning car, jumped back into Tom's car and sped off down the road, throwing their beer cans out of the car windows. It wouldn't be long before Tim's last words would come true. One night, when Tom, Dave, and Jack were driving through town looking for trouble, Tim's ghost appeared in the back seat of Tom's car and said in an eerie voice, "I told you I would be back." And then all of a sudden, Tim's ghostly figure vanished into thin air. They all looked at each other and said, "It must be the beer." Tom just drove on as though it was just a dream. But the hell they caused everyone in town was about to come to an inevitable end for all of them. Tim started appearing in Tom, Dave, and Jack's dreams, giving them no rest or comfort throughout their days to come. When Tom and Jack went over to Dave's house to pick him up for another fun-filled day of terrorizing the townspeople, they found Dave hanging from the top of his staircase, swinging back and forth. Tom and Jack rushed over to cut him down, but Dave was cold. Tom and Jack started calling out to Tim's ghost, telling him they were going to get him for this. Then all of a sudden Tim was laughing and appeared right in front of Jack and Tom and said, "You can't kill me. I'm already dead. I told you all to kill me, or I'll be back. But you didn't do the job right. So now I'm going to kill you both, soon. And there's nothing both of you can do to stop me. You will pay for terrorizing this town, mark my words." Jack and Tom tried to tackle Tim to the ground, but they just collided into each other and fell to the floor. Tim let out an eerie laugh and said, "Watch your backs, because I'll be there every step of the way to prolong the hell. I'm going to put you both through." Jack and Tom went out to Tom's car and sped off down the road, looking to take their anger out on anyone that crossed their path. Jack said, "Look, there's Bill Edwards, pull over. Let's beat him." Tom pulled the car over, and they both got out of the car, knocked him to the ground. And as Tom and Jack raised their fists to punch him, Tim's ghost appeared out of nowhere. Tim's ghost grabbed Jack and Tom's fists and squeezed them so hard it crushed their bones. They both yelled out Tim's name, and Bill said, "What's going on?" "Did you see him?" replied Tom and Jack. Bill got up off the ground and dusted himself off and said, "You both need help." Tom and Jack pleaded for Bill to help them, as their hands were mangled and bloody, but Bill just kept walking, ignoring their pleas. Tim said, "I told you I would be everywhere. I told you I would be everywhere, until you're both dead." Tim also said, "How does it feel to have the tables turned?" Jack and Tom replied, "Please let us go. We won't cause any more trouble." "Sorry, guys. You should have thought of that when I pleaded for you to spare my life. But you all laughed. You threw my battered body on top of the burning car, sped off down the road drinking your beer, and laughing about what you just did to me. So I'm just returning the favour. I hope you enjoy the hell I'm going to put you through." Jack and Tom just got back in Tom's car and drove down the road, wishing this nightmare would end. Then as they were driving around town, looking for someone to listen to them about the ghost haunting them from the grave, Tim's spirit appeared in the back seat of Tom's car, put his cold hands on their shoulders and said, "Did you miss me? I sure missed you both. I know we're all going to have a hell of a time together before you both take your last breath." "Leave us be. I told you we're not going to cause any more trouble," explained Tom. "I'm sorry, guys. I don't have anything to do but cause you both hell. And I'm a ghost who lives up to my promise. I promised you both days and nights of hell. That's what I intend on doing, so sit back and relax and enjoy the ride before you both die," said Tim. As the days and nights wore on, Tom and Jack slowly went insane. They stopped eating and sleeping. Tom and Jack were pleading for Tim to end their lives, but Tim just said, "Why? We're all having such a good time. And besides, I feel we're all becoming such great friends." Jack finally said, "I've had enough." He went out to the balcony of his apartment and threw himself over the balcony to his death. Tim laughed and watched Jack hit the pavement and said, "Well, it looks like it's just me and you, Tom, now. And once I visit Tom and watch him end his life, I guess I'll go back to my grave and sleep. Then the townspeople will have peace in their town once again." Tim appeared in Tom's bedroom as Tom's weak body was lying on his bed and said, "Tom, why don't you pull the gun out of your drawer and shoot yourself?" Tom reached for the drawer, but was too weak to open it. So Tim opened it for him and placed the gun in his hand, helped him point it at his head. Tim said, "Pull the trigger." Tom didn't have quite enough energy left in his frail body to pull the trigger. So Tim said, "Let me help you with that," and pulled the trigger. And Tom's brain matter was splattered all over his bed and he was dead. Tim laughed and said, "Well, my job is done here. Now I can go rest in peace, and so can this town." The end. And that is another horror story from Drac von Stoller. Thank you so much for listening, and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to the collection by Drac von Stoller. Wisteria here. This story is called No Trespassing. Delbert Thompson lived all by himself on a farm deep in the country and never bothered anyone until a group of teenagers' car broke down about half a mile down the road from Delbert's farm. The teens were only looking to use Delbert's phone to get help, but Delbert was in no mood for company, so the teens picked the wrong door to knock on. Delbert was sitting in his rocking chair on his front porch, carving a piece of wood, when he stopped what he was doing and noticed a group of people heading his way. Delbert panicked and said, "They're not going to get my money." Delbert ran inside the house and got his rifle out of his gun cabinet, sat back down in his rocking chair, ready to kill anyone that tried to get his money. Delbert was paranoid about his cash under his mattress. He never believed in keeping his money in the bank. The teens made their way to the steps of the house, and one of the teens, Dan, asked if they could use his phone to get a tow truck for their broken-down vehicle. Delbert replied, "You ain't coming in my house and taking my money. Can't you read the sign? No trespassing." Dan asked, "Come on, let us use your phone." Delbert rose out of his rocking chair and pointed the rifle at Dan's chest and said, "Get off my property." "Look, listen, dude, we mean no harm," exclaimed Dan. Then Delbert said, "I warned you all," and opened fire, killing Dan instantly. The other teenagers started running for their lives, but Delbert was a good shot and never missed. Delbert was able to take down the other two teens with a single shot to the head. If only the teenagers' car would have broken down somewhere else, they may still be alive. Delbert was psychotic and didn't want anyone on his property. He had no problem pulling the trigger and killing anyone of fear they would kill him and take all his money. Delbert took the three teens' bodies inside his house and dismembered their bodies, only to be eaten then by Delbert. The only part Delbert didn't care to eat was their heads, so he took the severed heads to his bedroom and put them on his four posts of the bed. Delbert lifted his mattress and got a handful of cash and went over to each severed head on the four posts of the bed, and he was waving the cash in front of their heads and said, "I told you all you ain't getting my money." Delbert decided to lie down for a while, but wanted some flesh to chew on, so he went to the freezer and pulled out a severed arm. He cut off a piece of flesh and placed the flesh in a skillet and cooked it to his liking. Then went over to the kitchen cabinet, opened a bottle of whiskey, took a swig, and started chewing on the flesh. Delbert began to talk to the severed heads about how tasty their flesh was, and went over to his bed and turned the severed heads facing him so he could speak to them. Delbert staggered back and forth next to his bed, talking aloud, which was all gibberish, and then he fell, face first on his bed, and passed out. About an hour later, Delbert was startled by a knock at the door, causing him to go into panic mode once again. This time it was the sheriff. Delbert didn't even ask who was at the door. He grabbed his shotgun and shot through the front door, killing the sheriff instantly. Delbert swung open his front door, and the sheriff was lying on his back on Delbert's porch in a pool of blood, dead. Delbert dragged the sheriff's body inside, slammed the door behind him, and said, "Why did you have to do that? Why? Now you're going to join these stupid teenagers who tried to steal my money." Delbert went to the kitchen and got a butcher's knife out of the drawer, proceeded to chop the sheriff's head off, and placed his head on the last post on his bed. Delbert was enjoying killing and was ready for the next poor soul to knock at the door, but Delbert was too impatient to wait for a knock on the door, so he decided to sit in his rocking chair on the porch with a rifle, and if anyone drove in front of his house, they would be shot on sight. Delbert placed a strip of spikes on the road, so any vehicle travelling in front of the house, their tires would blow, and he would pick them off with his rifle and have a fire pit, burning their dead bodies. He would cover them, actually, with a barbecue, maybe make a tasty meal with some sauce. Who knows? Rumours started spreading around town about strange things going on at Delbert's farm. One witness that barely made it out alive said he saw Delbert drinking whiskey and eating what looked like an arm while rocking his rocking chair on the porch. Finally, after 6 months, the frightened eyewitnesses called the police to investigate the strange goings-on at Delbert's farm. It's a shame some of these witnesses didn't come forward a little sooner to the police, instead of just spreading rumours that the town didn't believe. So the body count escalated during these 6 months. Now the police had their work cut out for them. When the police arrived at Delbert's farm, there was quite a gun battle. But Delbert didn't stand a chance from all the firepower the police had. Delbert was killed, which brought his reign of terror to an end. And now, the town can finally live in peace, though the rumours and the myth and legend still stand as today. The end. Thank you for listening to this Drakon story, and many blessings. Wisteria, energy, twister. Wisteria, energy, twister. Hello everyone, Wisteria here. Let's get into another Drakon Stoller classic. This is called Your Cheating Heart. Bill realised that he didn't love his new bride, Susan, anymore. When the honeymoon was over about a year, Bill ran an insurance business that was doing well and always stayed longer hours than needed, and his new bride was alone in a big empty house that should have been full of love. Susan tried her best to get Bill to notice her more, but it was no use. Bill started sleeping on the couch, sometimes would come home later than any normal husband would that loved his wife. One night, Susan got out of bed and went downstairs to the living room where Bill was sleeping. She turned on the light, and as she was standing with both hands on her hips, she noticed something red on his collar. She bent over and grabbed the neck of his collar and smelled it and said, "Just what I thought." She shook him to wake him up, but he was too drunk. That it would take more than just a few shakes to wake him up. She said, "I know just the thing to wake this cheating man up." Susan had had all she could take from his coldness, and took the beer bottle out of his hand and broke it over his head. Bill jumped off the couch. "Why did you do that?" "Are you cheating on me?" asked Susan. Bill replied, "What in the hell are you talking about?" "Don't pretend you're not," explained his heartbroken wife. "If you wanted to know the truth, I was never really in love with you. I didn't want to hurt your feelings, so I married you anyway. Are you satisfied?" explained Bill. Instead of Susan throwing a big fit, she decided to make him pay a heavy price for breaking her heart and cheating on her. Susan acted like it was no big deal with what he said or what he'd done to her. She said in a calm voice, even though she didn't mean it, "It's okay, darling. I love you anyway." Bill replied, "Are you crazy? If someone did that, what I've just done to you, I'd want them dead." "I can't help it. I'm crazy in love with you," replied Susan. She asked Bill, "Would you like another beer?" Bill said, "You bet." Susan went and got a cheating husband beer out of the refrigerator, but instead of rushing back to him with the beer in hand, she decided to pour a sleeping powder in his beer and plan the hell that would be brought upon him when he awoke from his deep sleep. Susan handed him his beer, and he gulped it down. Within minutes, he was out like a light. As he lay there sound asleep, she pulled down his pants, removed his testicles, and closed the cuts with a bandage. So when he awoke from his deep sleep and got up, went into the kitchen to see what his wife was cooking, he would get a shock. He came up behind her and said, "What are you cooking? That smells so good." "Oh, it's something special in hopes we can forget about how much you hurt me and try to move forward so this will never happen again," said his wife, but she was holding back tears. "Are you sure you're not mad at me?" replied her husband. "No, I'm not upset. Why, don't you sit down and, while I finish cooking this meal for you, sit at the table. I'll bring it out as soon as it's ready," she replied, as her anger was building. "Okay. I want a beer with this wonderful meal." "No problem, darling." she said as she was stirring the meal in a skillet in anger. As her husband was sitting at the kitchen table, he started to sober up. The effects of the sleeping medication wore off. Moments later, he was feeling a lot of discomfort in his groin area. And, by the time he was going to tell her about it, she placed the meal and the beer in front of him. As he was cutting into the round piece of food, he looked a little closer and said, "Honey, this piece of meat has hair all over it." She started laughing hysterically and he said, "I'm starting to feel nauseated." "Oh, quit being a big baby and dig in. I know you're going to like it. You helped me put this wonderful meal together." "What do you mean, I helped you put this meal together?" asked her husband. "Why don't you check inside your pants?" said his wife. He immediately got up from the kitchen table, pulled his pants down and got the shock of his life. There was blood all over both legs. "What? Why did you have to do that?" his wife screamed out. "Because you betrayed me, and the pain was so great." Then he removed the bandage and fainted from the horrible sight between his legs. After the cheating husband lay on the floor passed out, she took a butcher's knife out of the kitchen drawer, stabbed him in the chest, cut out his heart from this chest and placed it in a skillet and fried it. Then she put the cooked heart on a plate and cut a piece off and ate it and washed it down with a glass of wine. A lesson to be learned if you cheat. You may end up as a tasty meal on someone's plate, or you just might lose your nuts. The end. Yeah, I've heard some cheating stories, but that's a good old classic right there. Probably, when you find out they're cheating on you, it's best not to be angry or anything. Revenge is very sweet, and karma is the best medicine. Trust me. Many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to the stories by Drac von Stoller. This is the next story. It's called The Gallows on Hell Hill Island. Hell Hill Island is what I would call a place of beauty and a residence of death. Any visitor or resident that stopped out of line was sure to find themselves swinging from the gallows on Hell Hill Island. Hell Hill Island was founded in 1863 by Marshal Sam Tucker, that didn't believe in a fair trial because of his short fuse. If you backtalked the marshal, he would shoot you in both legs, then drag your wounded body with the rope he held as he rode his horse up to the gallows to be hung high. And when the marshal was through watching the dead body swing back and forth on the gallows, he would set their body on fire, light his cigar from the flames of the body. The marshal would leave the charred body hanging from the gallows, ride his horse back to town to bring the residents to see the aftermath, and let them know this is how they would end up if they stepped out of line. Of course, we all know there is someone in the crowd who would not learn a lesson from what Marshal Sam Tucker had to say. That one person was Jimmy Bellows, and Jimmy decided to play a little prank on Marshal Sam Tucker. Jimmy and a friend went up to the gallows of Hell Hill Island, and the plan was for Jimmy to be hanging from the gallows with a noose round his neck, and when the marshal got ready to set his body on fire, Jimmy would free himself from the rope and start laughing at the marshal. Then Jimmy and his friend would run back to town and make a laughing stock of the marshal. But Jimmy would play a trick on the wrong person that would prove fatal to Jimmy and his friend. The plan was going fine until Jimmy started laughing at the marshal. Of course, he knew the boy was taunting him. So the marshal said, "You think this is funny?" Before Jimmy could free himself from the noose, the marshal said, "Who do you think you're dealing with, son?" I think you and your friend should hang side by side as I watch both of your bodies burn." Jimmy was crying and calling out to his friend to help him. But his friend decided to make a run for it. And as Jimmy's friend was running, the marshal pointed his 30-30 Winchester at the back, and, well, down went his friend. Jimmy was losing consciousness, and the marshal dragged Jimmy's friend to the gallows, put the noose around his neck and pulled the rope high, and with a couple of jerking motions, Jimmy's friend was dead. Jimmy let loose of his grip and jerked a few times. Then he was dead. The marshal set both of the boys' bodies on fire, lit his cigar and said, "Stupid boys. And I've got to go to that town and hopefully everyone will know I mean business." The marshal swung open the saloon doors, and everyone got real quiet. Then Marshal Sam Tucker said, "Listen up, everyone. There are a couple of bodies hanging from the gallows that thought I was joking about hanging anyone that got out of line. Hopefully, when you all see these poor boys' bodies hanging from the gallows, you'll know this is no joke." The townspeople followed the marshal to the gallows, and the look on everyone's face was that of how could you kill two innocent young boys. The townspeople overpowered the marshal, took his gun from him and shot him in both legs and arms, then strung him high up on his own gallows on Hell Hill Island, then set his body on fire as his flesh burned to the bone. Legend has it that in the wee hours of the night, you can see the dead bodies of the marshal and the two young boys hanging from the gallows on fire. Another is that people from the town passing by the gallows after midnight have been chased by Marshall, trying to bring them back to be hung on the gallows. So if you're in the mood to take a chance to get a glimpse of Marshall and anyone that has been hung from the gallows on Hell Hill Island, come and stay there. And maybe, just maybe too, you can get the willies scared out of you, like so many brave souls have done. The end. It's interesting. Thank you for listening to this short story from Drac von Stoller. Many blessings. Hello everyone. So, this is the next tale from Drac von Stoller, and it is called The Place Where There Were No Graves. Dan Edwards was getting sick and tired of everybody dying around him and having to attend so many funerals. One night, while he was lying in bed watching TV and daydreaming, he said aloud, "I wish there was a place where there were no graves." So he immediately got out of bed, sat down at the computer and searched for hours. Then, just as he was about to give up, he got lucky. There was a small island barely on the map that never buried their dead. Dan just had to find out for himself if this was good and true. So he got on the next flight the very next morning. Dan boarded the plane, put on his headphones and listened to Drac von Stoller's audiobooks on the way to his destination. The plane finally landed after 13 hours. Dan removed his headphones and looked out the window in the plane and said, "Wow, this island's beautiful. I can't wait to get off this plane and meet these lovely people and ask them why there are no graves anywhere on this island." Dan stepped off the plane and was greeted by a tour guide, so he wouldn't be lost and have to find things on his own. Dan boarded a bus for his tour of the island. The trip was exciting and helpful, but Dan still wanted to know what happened when their loved one dies. Dan tapped the tour guide on the shoulder and said, "Could I ask you a question?" "Sure," replied the tour guide. "If someone dies, what happens to their body?" asked Dan. Then all of a sudden the bus swerved, avoiding a collision with an animal crossing the bus's path. Dan lost his train of thought, so the tour guide didn't get to answer his question. The bus pulled into the hotel where Dan would be staying the remainder of the week until he decided one way or another if he would remain on the island for the rest of his life. Before Dan got off the bus to get his luggage, the tour guide said, "Sir, be ready for dinner at 6 p.m. Don't forget to be out in front of the hotel at 6 p.m. sharp," explained the tour guide. "Don't worry. I wouldn't miss this dinner for the world," replied Dan. Dan gathered his luggage off the bus and headed to his room to take a shower. Then after his bath, he sat on the balcony to feel the warm wind hit his face, catch a few rays of sunlight before the sun went down. 6 p.m. arrived before he knew it. See, he dozed off in his chair. If he wouldn't have woke up when he did, Dan might have missed his free meal and been upset at himself. But he made it seconds flat, and out of breath, he sat down in his seat on the tour bus. The tour bus driver said, "I see you made it on time, Dan," in an eerie voice. Dan said, "How do you know my name? I never said my name. You never asked me either." "Dan, we know everybody's name on this island," said the tour guide. Dan asked the tour guide to take him back to his hotel. The tour guide just ignored him and drove faster to where Dan would be getting his meal to die for. Dan's love for the island grew weary, and he was ready to get on the next plane off this island. But the islanders had other plans for this tourist, and leaving the island alive wasn't one of those. Finally, after terrifying bus drive and a change in the tour guide's friendliness, the bus pulled into an entrance of the mansion. The tour guide said, "I hope you're hungry, because this will be the best meal you've ever had in your life." Dan replied, "We'll see about that." Unbeknownst to him, the tour guide was a voodoo witch doctor. As Dan and the voodoo witch doctor sat down at the dinner table, Dan's drink was laced with a paralyzing drug to keep him from trying to escape the horror that was about to begin. As Dan was drinking from his cup, the meal to die for was placed on the table, and Dan said, "What's underneath the silver top?" "You'll see," said the voodoo doctor. The silver top was raised off the plate, and Dan spit out his drink and said, What in the hell is going on here? You were so eager to come to this island and want to know why we don't bury our dead." "It's because we believe that nothing should go waste, not even the dead," laughed the voodoo doctor. The voodoo witch doctor got up from his seat, and the waiter handed him a sword, and he came up behind Dan and said, "Well, Dan, seeing that you know our little secret, you're going to have to die." Dan tried to move, but whatever the voodoo witch doctor put in his drink paralyzed his body. The voodoo witch doctor laughed and swung the sword, cutting Dan's head clean off his shoulders. Dan finally got his wish to find a place where they never had graves, but the reason cost him his head. The end. Well, that's interesting, and just to let you know, voodoo's not like that, okay? I just want to make that clear. It's just a story for entertainment purposes only. It's fictional, and I just want to make it very clear that voodoo is not like that, and they definitely do not murder people or anything like that. It's a fictional story for entertainment. Thank you for listening, and many blessings. Hello guys, welcome back to the Drakbonstola collection. This story is called Screams in the Night. Every night, just a little after midnight, screams echoed all through Castle Webley. That was unbearable for any of the guests to get a good night's rest. The owners of the castle forewarned any guests that stayed the night that blood-curdling screams would go on through the night until morning. The guests were also unaware that the owners, Sir Arthur Webley and his wife Elizabeth, were dead and buried in the family crypt. The reason Sir Arthur Webley and his wife Elizabeth were among the living dead was because of a guest at their party who was a vampire by the name of Count Drac von Stoller, the Prince of Darkness. Count Drac von Stoller chose Elizabeth as his vampire bride and entered her room that night and bit her on the neck, and while the Count was sucking the blood from her neck, her husband had dozed off down in the kitchen while drinking some wine, and he woke up to a scream. He dashed upstairs to his bedchambers and burst through the doors where his beautiful wife Elizabeth was sleeping. Count Drac von Stoller turned around with blood dripping from his mouth, and the two fought. But Sir Arthur was no match for the Count. The Count bit Arthur on the neck, thus turning him into a vampire, just like his wife Elizabeth. And from that day forward, Sir Arthur Webley and his wife Elizabeth roamed the castle as the living dead, looking for victims to quench their thirsts for blood, as well as the Count's. To lure a large number of victims was to hold lavish parties in the ballroom in honour of Count Drac von Stoller, so that Sir Arthur and his wife could quench their thirst for blood. As Drac, Sir Arthur and Elizabeth were sitting at the table drinking red wine, well, that's what they called it, but actually it was human blood, past victims. Drac said, "You sure have a lot of people in this town to sustain my bloodthirsty appetite." Sir Arthur replied, "We're pleased to oblige." Drac chimed in and said, "Well, it's getting late for our guests, and I think we need to go pay them a visit. Let the screaming begin." Drac found some beautiful maidens to stay the night by telling them to look into his eyes. He put them into a trance, led them up to his bedchambers, where they would be spending the night. Sir Arthur and Elizabeth found them some victims as well, and led them upstairs to other bedchambers. As the remaining guests left the castle moments later, the Count, Sir Arthur and Elizabeth entered the bedchamber rooms, where their victims lay waiting with their necks exposed for the biting to begin. As each one bit into their victims' necks, their screams echoed all through the castle, except for one of the victims Drac chose. Just as he was bending over with blood dripping from his mouth, with blood-red eyes and his sharp teeth were about to sink into this beautiful maiden, she rose up and said, "Do you know who I am?" Drac replied, "No, I don't." She chimed in and said, "I'm a witch, you fool, and has the same interest as you do, being blood." Then the witch showed her razor-sharp teeth to Count Drac von Stoller. A battle ensued. The witch, wicked Ginny, put up a fierce struggle that put Drac's powers to the test. But in the end, the Prince of Darkness prevailed. Count Drac von Stoller cut the witch's head off, placed it on the fireplace mantel, and left her decapitated body on the bed she slept in for the next guest that entered the room to get a fright of the life. Count Drac von Stoller dusted off his hands and said, "I think I hear a scream coming from the next room. I'm still thirsty, and haven't quite quenched my thirst, so I'll just see what rooms are left that Sir Arthur and Elizabeth haven't been to." Count Drac von Stoller's reign of bloodthirsty terror was about to come to a screeching halt the next morning, because Van Helsing, the vampire hunter, was notified by relatives of missing persons that they were last seen at the castle, and they never returned to their homes. Van Helsing was excited to track down this blood-sucking vampire finally, and knew the right opportune moment would be when the sun came out. Van Helsing brought his vampire hunter kit with him to the castle, ready to drive a stake through his heart. Van Helsing broke the lock of the family crypt and headed down the steps to where Count Drac von Stoller's coffin was, and he pried open the coffin with a crowbar. He slowly rose up the lid of that casket, and there was Count Drac von Stoller resting after a bloodthirsty night. Van Helsing reached in his bag, pulled out an hammer and a stake, placed the stake directly where his heart would be, penetrated him, killing him instantly. But just as the hammer was about to pierce the Count's chest, the Count grabbed Van Helsing by the throat and said, "Van Helsing, nice to meet you again." Drac told Van Helsing to remove the crucifix from his neck, but instead of taking it off and throwing it aside, he placed the cross on the Count's forehead and watched it burn into his flesh, then tossed holy water over him. The Count released his grip from Van Helsing's neck. Then Van Helsing drove the stake deep into the Count's heart, watching blood ooze from the Count's mouth. The Count's last words were, "Van Helsing, I'll be back." Van Helsing wiped the sweat from his forehead, dropped to his knees with a sigh of relief, knowing he just killed the Prince of Darkness. Van Helsing said, as he was breathing heavily, "This town can finally live in peace." Yes, the town will live in peace, just as long as someone doesn't come down to the family crypt and remove the stake from Count Drac von Stoller's heart. Van Helsing turned away from the Count's coffin and noticed two other coffins and lifted each lid. Sir Arthur and his wife were also among the living dead. Van Helsing drove a stake through their hearts, killing them. Van Helsing gathered his hammer and stake, placed them in his vampire hunting kit, and left the castle to tell the townspeople they won't have to be afraid anymore. The end. And that is quite the story of Van Helsing and Count Drac von Stoller. Haunting vampires. Interesting. Thanks for listening, and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the stories by Drac von Stoller. This story is called No More Mr. Nice Guy. Henry Bates had a very reclusive life, until one day, the nagging from his wife made him snap. Things started dying. All Henry wanted was to enjoy his retirement like a normal, hard-working man, but his wife had other plans. Relaxing wasn't one of them. One day when Henry was relaxing by the fire, his wife Marjorie came up to him and said, "Henry, I thought I told you to take out the trash, sweep the floor, clean the attic. Our room isn't an hotel, and just because you have retired, I'm not going to watch you lay around and watch your belly rise from all the beer drinking while there's yard work, etc." She went on for hours nagging him, and when he got up from the recliner to get another beer, well, more the nagging persisted. "That's it." "That's what?" said Marjorie. Henry shouted. "You'll see." "Henry, get back here this instant," yelled Marjorie. Henry went into the garage and grabbed the shovel. As Marjorie was pointing her finger and calling him names, Henry swung the shovel, hitting her upside the head, and Marjorie hit the floor. Henry knew if she got off the floor, she would have him arrested for assault and battery and attempted murder. So Henry said to himself, "What am I going to do?" As he was pacing back and forth in the kitchen, Henry decided to finish her off. So Henry gave Marjorie another hard whack upside the head. Then he knelt to feel her pulse, but there was none. "Well, I'm glad I finally stood up for myself. Stood up to that battle axe and put her in her place," Henry said. He picked up his dead wife's body and placed her in a chair in the attic and locked the door behind him. Henry was whistling as he was walking down the stairs, back to his recliner to take a nap, as the warm fire calmed his nerves. As the night wore on, Henry started hallucinating about his wife coming down from the attic and doing him in. Henry's blurry eyes opened and visions of his wife with a shovel in her hands, coming at him ready to do him in, were there. Henry immediately broke out in cold sweat, jumped out of the recliner, ran up the stairs to see if his dead wife was in the attic, slumped over in the chair. Sure enough, Marjorie's lifeless body was still slumped over in the chair, and Henry started laughing and said, "Oh, it was just a dream." Henry kissed his wife on the forehead and told her he would come back and check on her later, bring her something to eat. Henry said to Marjorie that killing her was the best thing for their marriage. Then he said, "Marjorie, this way we can be together forever, and you won't have to nag me about anything any more. Should anyone try to take you away from me, they will be sorry." Henry exited the attic, closing the door behind him, forgetting to lock it. I mean, you never know. Curious visitors may come by. They may want to peek inside. I mean, there was a stench coming from that part of the house. Even though Henry hated his wife's nagging, he still loved her very much. As the days wore on and the terrifying dreams of his wife coming at him with a shovel only got worse, and Henry could not distinguish between fantasy and reality. Henry wasn't getting much sleep, he was drinking excessively, he was trying to wash away the death of his wife, but it was no use. Henry was a doomed man. Then a knock at the door put Henry in a panic mode, because if he let anyone in his house, the stench would cause them to run out of the house and call the police to visit him, and Henry didn't want that to happen. Henry thought to himself, who would take care of his dead wife in the attic? So Henry had to think fast and come up with a plan. Being that Henry wasn't a smart man, the only thing that came to his mind was to be, well, let's silence anyone who has to enter the home. Henry told the person at the door to wait just a minute, and he went to the basement, rummaging through his toolbox, and came across an hammer. Henry cautiously approached the front door, ready to let in the doomed person. Henry opened the door and said, "Aunt Claire, what brings you here?" "Henry, I was hoping I could stay at your place for a couple of days before I head back home." Henry didn't want to cause suspicion, so he said, "Sure thing." Claire entered. Henry closed the door behind her, took her suitcase and coat, and then showed her where she would be staying for the next few days. "Henry, what's that smell?" Claire said. "Oh, it's probably a dead rat in the attic. I'll take care of that real soon," explained Henry. "Thanks, I would greatly appreciate it," said Claire as she covered her nose entering her room. "Henry, where's Marjorie?" asked Claire. "She's out of town visiting some relatives. She won't be back for a couple of weeks," explained Henry. "Well, Henry, I've had a really long drive and I'd like to turn in for the night," said Aunt Claire. She yawned. Henry said, "I'll see you in the morning." Henry went to his recliner and fell asleep, shortly after watching his favourite TV show, Unsolved Mysteries. About an hour later, Claire couldn't sleep because of the foul odour from the attic. Claire got out of bed and put on a robe to investigate the smell coming from the attic. Claire was about to get the shock of her life, and she had left well enough alone, but she couldn't ignore the smell. The closer she got to the attic, the more overwhelming the smell became. Henry woke from his sleep and noticed Aunt Claire's door was ajar, decided to check on her. Henry flicked on the light switch in her room, but there were no signs of Claire. Then Henry ran to the attic, and just as Henry entered the attic, Claire was screaming. Henry realised he still had the hammer in the back of his pants. Claire shouted, "What did you do to Marjorie?" Henry replied, "You shouldn't have come up here. Now I'm going to have to kill you." Claire started screaming as the claw end of the hammer that Henry was holding in his hand came down, splitting her skull. Henry didn't want his Aunt Claire to suffer, so he gave her a couple more whacks. The last blow Henry gave Aunt Claire with the hammer got stuck in her skull, so he just left the hammer where it struck her. Henry picked up his Aunt Claire's body and placed it next to his wife's body in a chair and said, "Look, darling, I brought you someone to keep you company. Aunt Claire, I think you two will have a lot of catching up to do. Well, I've got to go and do some things. I need to go to the hardware store. I need to get a new hammer. I won't be long. Is there anything I can get you both? Silence, obviously. As Henry drove off to the hardware store, his next-door neighbour wanted to find out what the screaming was all about, because of course, neighbours do hear this stuff. Henry just realised he had Claire's blood all over his shirt, so he turned his car around and headed back home to change his shirt. The nosy neighbour should have reported the screaming to the police, but instead decided to take it upon himself to make sure it wasn't just a TV. The neighbour called out to Henry, but there was no answer. So the neighbour said to herself, "What's that smell? I think it's coming from the attic." As Henry pulled in the front of his house, he noticed the front door was wide open. It wasn't only the attic door he was forgetting to lock now, was it? It was much more. Henry knew he had to act fast, so he went inside the garage and got his shovel. Just as Henry grabbed his shovel, he heard screaming from inside the house. Henry bolted through the door that leads from the garage to inside the house. The neighbour ran down from the attic stairs, and just as she reached the bottom step, Henry swung the shovel, hitting her in the head. Henry swung the shovel so hard, he halfway severed her head. "Why in the hell did you do that? Now look what happened," Henry shouted. Henry picked up his neighbour's body off the stairs and brought her upstairs to the attic to join his wife and Aunt Claire. Henry said, "I wish everyone would leave me alone." Henry changed his shirt and got back in his car and decided this time he was going to buy a gun and shoot anyone that entered his home. As nightfall came, the nightmares were back again. As Henry was resting in his recliner, every person Henry killed haunted him. He slept with his gun loaded by his side. The next morning, paranoid Henry jumped out of his recliner because of a knock on the door. Henry opened the door and said, "Leave me alone. I'm trying to get some sleep." Before the person had a chance to say anything, Henry immediately shot the person at the door, only to find out it was just the mailman. Henry dragged his body inside to his house to join the rest of the dead in the attic. After Henry placed the postman's body next to the other bodies, he said, "Oh, I think it's time for a drink." Henry got back in his car and drove to the liquor store to pick up a case of Jack Daniels. This was to celebrate the killings. As Henry entered the liquor store, he pulled up his pants and said to the cashier man, "Man, life is good, and if you don't mind, I'm kind of in a hurry to get back home and celebrate with my friends." "What would you like, sir?" asked the cashier. Henry answered with a big smile on his face, "I would like a case of Jack Daniels Black Label." The cashier said, "Sure thing." Henry paid the cashier with stolen money out of his dead victim's pockets. Henry told the cashier to have a nice day. He sped off down the road with the driver's side window down and reached in the case of liquor, pulled out a bottle of Jack Daniels, unscrewed the top, and took a big gulp. Henry honked his horn as he was speeding down the road to his house while swigging down his whiskey. As Henry pulled into his driveway, it started raining and lightning. He pulled his car into the garage and grabbed the case of liquor, went to the kitchen to get some glasses for his dead friends in the attic. Henry was excited as he was walking up the stairs to the attic. He flung open the attic door in a drunken state and placed glasses in their hands, poured each one a drink. Henry raised his bottle of Jack Daniels in the air and toasted to his dead friends and said goodbye to them and went downstairs to a recliner, then passed out. As the clock struck midnight, Henry's party days were about to come to a screeching halt because his dead friends were about to pay him a visit, and this visit would not be a friendly one. Marjorie, Claire, the postman, and the neighbour rose up off their chairs and headed down the stairs, calling Henry's name, saying they were going to get him. Henry thought it was just the same dream he'd been having all along, so he just brushed it off as another bad dream and fell back to sleep. But the voices were getting louder and louder, now chanting, "Henry, we're going to kill you." Finally, it was Henry's day to die. Unlike any killer, most don't want to die, but that's too bad. They should have thought about it before they killed. Henry didn't stand a chance. All the dead wished for was to tear into his flesh like a bunch of wild animals. The dead gave it to him good first with a shovel in the head, then a bullet and a hammer to the chest, as Henry begged for his life. Then, if that wasn't enough, they were hungry. They finished him off by eating his brains and his flesh. When morning arrived, another neighbour couldn't shake off the noises coming from Henry's house, so he called the police. When the police opened Henry's front door, they could barely stomach the stench. And as they entered the living room where Henry's recliner was, they were thrown back by a gruesome scene. 4 bodies were lying next to Henry. Henry was a bloody mess. His brain was missing. Chunks of his flesh missing from his body, like wild animals had attacked him. But they would never actually find out what happened to Henry. So the secret died along with him. The end. And that is basically a story of revenge, but was it real? Or did Henry just totally go insane and kill himself? And then thought it was the spirits that were killing him? Or did they really come back from the dead like zombies and eat him? That's for you to decide. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you will enjoy the next. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the Dracmon Stoller collection. If you hear any snoring in the background, that's just Noogle is fast asleep. Anyway, this story is called The Cards of Death. Summer finally arrived. Jim and Edwards and his friends, Dan, Bob and Steve, all decided they would take a ride cross-country on the 19th century train to celebrate their long-awaited retirement. Jim called Dan and told him to make sure Bob and Steve were at his house by 3 p.m. because the train leaves out at 4 p.m. The weather was beautiful outside, perfect for a train ride. Jim got out his suitcase and packed his belongings and loaded his bag in his trunk, drove to Dan's house to pick up his buddies, who were waiting for his arrival. Jim pulled in Dan's driveway and honked his horn to let his buddies know he was outside waiting on them. Dan, Bob and Steve brought out their suitcases and loaded them into Jim's trunk and got in the car and drove to the train station for a fun-filled week of gazing at the beautiful scenery as the train travels through the mountains of many states along the way. Little did these friends know that their retirement trip on the train would send them into a world of the unknown. Finally, Jim and his friends arrived at the train station 15 minutes before the train's departure, so they had enough time to check in their luggage and board the train. Jim said, "Is everyone ready for a great experience?" And they all replied yes. Jim and his friends boarded the train, and the train blew its whistle, then slowly picked up speed down the railway through the tunnel. Jim and his friends were excited to be travelling together as friends on the 19th century train. Everything was going fine until a stranger entered their coach seating compartment and put his carry-on bag above Jim and Dan and said, "I hope you don't mind if I share your compartment because the other compartments are full." Jim replied, "Think that will be all right." Steve chimed in and said, "What's your name?" The stranger replied as he chuckled, "Dr. Death." Everyone started laughing and Bob asked, "How did you get that name?" "Because of these cards," replied Dr. Death as the cards spilled out onto the cabin floor. The men laughed and Dan stood up, got to his knees to help Dr. Death pick up his cards of death. Dr. Death sat down at the seat and asked, "Would anyone like to play?" Steve chimed in and said, "Sure, it sounds like a lot of fun." Dan said, "I know what kind of cards these are. They're tarot cards. I've seen a fortune teller use these, and I think it's just entertainment. There's no truth to what these cards can do." Dr. Death chuckled and said, "No, you're mistaken, young man. These cards are the cards of death. And if you play these cards, well, they will tell you how you're going to die." Dan again replied, "I'm not interested in your hocus pocus." Bob said, "I want to find out my fortune." "Are you sure?" asked Dr. Death. Come on, get on with it, old man, said Bob. Dr. Death shuffled his cards and placed each card face up and said, very interesting. What does it mean? Asked Bob nervously. The cards tell me you have a terrible gambling problem when it comes to poker, replied Dr. Death. So, what? Said Bob. Dr. Death proceeded to tell Bob that when he gets off the train and returns home, he will head to the casino and gamble his life savings away and not be able to cope with such a tragic event, decide to hang himself. Bob answered, You're out of your mind, old man. I've been gambling the better part of my life. Not once have I ever lost my total savings. And I'm sure not going to let that happen. Old man, mark my words, this will never happen to me in a million years. Dr. Death laughed and said, Ha, we shall see. Then Dr. Death pointed Dan and said, How about you? Dan replied, I'm still not interested. Steve, Bob, and Jim said, It's just for fun. Dr. Death chimed in and said, You all think this is a joke. I can assure you when each one of you steps off this train, you will be dead in a week. Jim replied, What's my fate? Dr. Death started turning over each card one by one as he gazed into Jim's eyes. Dr. Death said, Jim, you'll be resting in your chair by the fireplace smoking. Then you will pass out. Then the lit cigarette will fall out of your hand onto the chair, and in minutes you'll be up in flames with no one to come to your rescue. Steve looked at Dr. Death and said, Well, Dr. Death, there's only 2 of us left. Might as well find out our fate. Jim tried to reassure Steve that tarot cards are just for entertainment, which sometimes can be taken out of context. Jim said, Steve, when we are through with this cross-country train ride and plant our feet on solid ground back home, nothing is going to happen to any of us. Steve replied, You're right. I'm getting worked up for nothing. Dr. Death explained to the men that these particular cards were not picked up at the local store. These cards were dug up from a grave that was buried along with the demon witch. That still has the bloodstains on them. You can call my readings a hoax, but all hell will break loose when your trip is over, Dr. Death said. Okay, I get your drift. Just now tell me, how am I going to die? Said Steve. Dr. Death gazed into Steve's eyes and started turning each card over slowly and said, Your death will be the quickest of them all. When your feet hit the ground, you will be mistaken for a killer. That snuck on the train back at the last train stop. When you reach in your pocket and pull out your cigarette lighter to light your cigarette, which is shaped like a 38 special, a sharpshooter will have his scope pointed at your head, and with one shot to the head you will be dead. Screams will be heard and people running for cover, and as soon as the police get closer and look at you, they'll know you're not the killer, and it will be too late to turn back the hands of time and save you from your fate. Dr. Death, that was some story, said Steve. This is no story, I can assure you, replied Dr. Death. Dr. Death then turned towards Dan and gazed in his eyes and said, Looks like you're the last one. Dan said, Whatever, go ahead with your hocus pocus. Dr. Death proceeded to turn the cards over and said, This is a good one. Have you ever heard of spontaneous human combustion? Yes, I have. What's that got to do with me? As you arrive home from your long train ride and witness the tragic death of your friends, you will lie down on your bed. You will fall into a deep sleep. Then after a couple of days of not showing up for work, the police will be called to check on you, and when they get no answer at your door, they will be forced to break into your home, only to discover that all that's left of you when they enter the bedroom is a pile of ash on your bed, explained Dr. Death. Dr. Death said, Well, gentlemen, looks like the train ride is over. As he was laughing, then pulled a wig and mask off and smiled. Then said, I'm not Dr. Death. I am the demon witch, in the grave where these cards are buried with my dead body. But some friendly person said the mantra on my gravestone. Now, I'm here to bring death to you all. Dan, Steve, Jim, and Bob got out of their seats and ran off the train. And just as the Demon Witch predicted, Steve stepped off the train because he was nervous about the Demon Witch's prediction. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the pistol-shaped cigarette lighter, and then all of a sudden, the sound of gunfire rang out, followed by screams, and Steve was shot in the head and fell dead. After Steve was buried, Bob started to believe the Demon Witch's prediction was correct. Bob couldn't get his friend Steve's death out of his mind, so he started drinking heavily and gambling his life savings away, as the Demon Witch predicted he would. After Bob was thrown out of the casino for being sloppy drunk and threatening to kill everyone, he got up off the sidewalk, got into his car and drove back home. Bob was at the end of his rope, and he hung himself, just as the Demon Witch had said. The next morning, Dan and Jim heard the news that Bob had hung himself. And hearing the news that he lost another dear friend, Jim started pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace. He was sweating profusely and knew that a cigarette would calm his nerves. So he sat down in his chair and lit his cigarette. Moments later, he drifted off into a deep sleep. After a couple of days of not showing up for work, the police were called to investigate, and they discovered that the Demon Witch was right. It was set on fire. All that was left of Jim's body was an arm, 2 legs. The rest of his body was burned beyond recognition in his bed. A lesson to be learned: if a stranger pulls out a deck of cards with skulls on them and says, "I can predict how you will die," it might be a good idea not to play, unless knowing that what the stranger tells you just might come true doesn't actually bother you in the end. And that's the old tale of mind over matter. It works with everything. I do tarot cards. They're not evil, mine, or anything like that. It's just intuition, that's all. Anybody can do them. I think, anyway, personally, I think anybody can do them. But that's my feelings on it. And it should always be kept as sort of like entertainment purposes or whatever. But not that I don't believe in tarot card readings, I do believe in them. But the point is, that's Dougal snoring. The point is, it's mind over matter, right? If you have these things told to you, and then you start sort of thinking about it and believe this is how things are going to go, there is a good chance you can create that thing to happen, because your intentions are on creating it to happen because you're thinking about it so much. It's really strange how it works, and it's all about mind over matter and things, but it's very interesting nonetheless. So, that's a case of, were the cards true, or was it just the fact that these guys drilled it into the head so much it was going to come true that they created their own ending? So, as to say, it's totally up to you what you think to that one. Thank you for listening to this story, and many blessings. Hello everyone, Wisteria here, and another Drakbon story. This one's called A Grave Mistake. Even though we are warned not to do something, we do it anyway, regardless of the consequences and the fact they could be fatal. Jimmy and his 2 friends, Stephen and Billy, decided to camp out at a cemetery with no knowledge of its past. As night fell and the boys were exploring the cemetery, they came across a tombstone with writing on it that read, "Whosoever reads these words will not see daylight." Jimmy said, "I'm not going to read that out loud and take a chance that this isn't a bunch of hogwash." "What? Are you chicken?" said Billy, and Stephen as well, making chicken noises and laughing hysterically at Jimmy. "Okay, I'll read the words and let's get this straight out of the way. I'm not a chicken," exclaimed Jimmy. As the moon cast an eerie glow over the old cemetery, the wind whispered through the gnarled trees, carrying an unsettling chill that seemed to crawl down their spines. The boys' laughter had faded into nervous silence as they stood before the ominous tombstone. The words carved into the stone seemed to burn into their minds, and a feeling of foreboding settled heavily upon them. "What do you think this means?" Steve asked, his bravado waning in the face of the ominous inscription. "I don't know," Jimmy replied, his voice quivering slightly, despite his attempt to sound composed. "It's probably just some kind of prank or old legend meant to scare people." Billy, always the skeptic, snorted. "Yeah, like some dead guy's gonna come crawl out of the grave and get us." Still, there was an uneasiness that clung to them, a sense that they were trespassing on something ancient and powerful. It was as though the very air around the tombstone cackled with an otherworldly energy. "Come on, let's get out of here," Steve suggested, glancing around nervously. But Jimmy's curiosity had been piqued. "No, wait. I want to see if anything happens when I read it out loud." "Buddy, are you sure about this?" Billy asked, his bravado crumbling as he exchanged uneasy glances with Stephen. Jimmy hesitated for a moment, his gaze locked onto the words. "Yeah, I'm sure. It's just words on a stone, right?" With a deep breath, he cleared his throat and began to read the words aloud. As the last syllable left his lips, an eerie silence enveloped the graveyard. The air grew still, and the boys exchanged anxious glances, half expecting something to happen. But nothing did, and after a moment they all let out a nervous laughter. "See? Nothing happened," Jimmy said. "Come on, let's go back to the campsite," Steve urged, his voice betraying his anxiety. Just as they turned to leave, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. At first they thought it was their imagination, but the vibrations grew stronger, rattling the tombstones and causing the earth to shift. And then, with a horrifying realization, they watched in stunned horror as the grave before them began to crack and split open. A pale hand burst forth from the soil, followed by a figure that emerged, clawing its way to the surface. The boys' screams echoed through the cemetery as the corpse-like figure, dressed in tattered clothes and with hollow eyes, slowly rose to its feet. Frozen with fear, they could only watch as the figure turned its gaze towards them. Its lips moved, forming words that echoed in their minds rather than their ears. "You have awakened me." In that instant, panic overcame them, and the boys turned to run. But before they could take more than a few steps, the figure moved with a speed that defied its decrepit appearance. Bony fingers closed around their throats, squeezing with a vice-like grip that left them gasping for air. Their struggles were futile, their vision beginning to blur as darkness closed in. The world seemed to fade away, and the last thing they heard was a chilling whisper. The warning was clear. Word of the gruesome incident spread quickly, shrouding the old cemetery in a veil of dread and speculation. People from the nearby town whispered about the boys who had met their untimely demise. Victims of their own recklessness. The story reached far corners, catching the attention of a group of seasoned ghost hunters known as the Paranormal Investigation Team. The PIT team consisted of members Emily, the empathic medium, John, the tech expert, Sarah, the historian, and Mark, the fearless leader. They were drawn to cases that were shrouded in mystery and darkness, seeking to uncover the truth behind the unexplainable. The old cemetery had always been steeped in a haunted reputation. Legend had it that it was built on land cursed by an ancient ritual gone awry, a place where restless spirits roamed. The PIT team arrived armed with their equipment and determination to communicate with the entity that had risen from the grave. Night settled over the cemetery once again, and the PIT team set up their equipment near the tombstone that marked the faithful resting place. EMF meters blinked and voice recorders stood at ready. Emily closed her eyes, reaching out with her senses, trying to connect with any lingering spirit. "Is there anyone here?" she called out softly, her voice carrying a mixture of caution and respect. The wind picked up, causing the trees to rustle, but there was no discernible response. John adjusted his equipment while Sarah consulted her research notes, hoping to uncover more about the history of the cemetery. Mark, however, had a different idea. He approached the tombstone and cleared his throat, his voice echoing with authority. "If there's anyone here, make your presence known. We seek to understand and communicate." As Mark's words hung in the air, a subtle change seemed to wash over the surroundings. The temperature dropped, and a soft whisper echoed through the wind. Emily's eyes snapped open, her senses tingling. "I feel something," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Suddenly the air seemed to shimmer, and a faint apparition materialized near the tombstone. The figure bore a striking resemblance to the entity that had emerged before the tragic incident. Mark stepped forward cautiously. "Are you the one who rose from this grave?" The apparition's eyes locked onto Mark, in gaze intense and haunting. Then, in a voice that seemed to emanate from within the depths of earth, it spoke. "I am bound to this place, a guardian of the forbidden. The words you read held a pact that must be honored." Sarah's eyes widened as she pieced together the puzzle. The legend speaks of a guardian cursed to rise whenever these words are spoken aloud. Emily's brows furrowed in empathy. "You were meant to protect this place, weren't you? To prevent others from awakening whatever lies beneath?" The apparition nodded slowly, its form flickering in the moonlight. "I failed once, and darkness was unleashed upon the world. I will not let it happen again." Mark exchanged a solemn glance with his team members. "We seek to understand and help. We didn't know the consequences." The apparition's gaze softened slightly. "Ignorance does not absolve responsibility. But your intent is clear. I shall heed your words." At the first light of dawn, as it began to paint in the sky, the apparition faded slowly, the curse seemingly appeased by the conversation. The PIT team, a sense of closure settling over the cemetery. Though the tragedy of the boys' fates remained, the darkness that had lingered was replaced by a newfound understanding. And so, the old cemetery turned to its quiet slumber, its secrets guarded by a spectral sentinel who had found solace in the communication it had sought for centuries. The tale of the boys and the guardian became another chapter in the long history of the cemetery, a cautionary tale of heeding warnings and the potential consequences of unleashing forces beyond comprehension, should I say. And that is that Drac von Stoller story. Thank you for listening, and many blessings. Wisteria, energy, twister. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the Drac von Stoller collection. This one is called 666. Evil was about to fall upon the Delaney estate that Mike and Samantha could never have imagined. It was Halloween, and Samantha's contractions were unbearable, so her husband rushed his pregnant wife to the hospital to deliver their new bundle of joy. Mike told the doctor and nurse to take great care of his wife. The doctor and nurse reassured Mike they would take excellent care of her and not to worry. Mike waited patiently in the waiting room as the doctor and nurse delivered their beautiful baby. After a few hours, the baby finally arrived, and the doctor entered the waiting room and told Mike to come in the place, see his new baby. Mike entered, and his wife was all smiles and said, "Honey, it's a boy. I think he looks like a Johnny. What do you think?" asked his wife. "Johnny sounds fine to me," replied Mike. Mike was so excited and held his baby boy in his arms. Tears rolled down his cheeks and he said, "Darling, I think he likes me." Mike stayed the night in his wife's room with their new baby. But as they slept, an unforeseen force came into their place that was about to change their lives forever. When they both woke in the morning, morning came, and Samantha, her husband and baby left the hospital to their new home. It wasn't until after little Johnny turned 6 years of age that things around the Delaney estate turned deadly. The first time that Johnny had the mark of the beast was June the 6th. It was the 6th month, the 6th day, and Johnny was 6. All the numbers represented 666. Johnny's mother would be his first kill. As a demonic voice told him, his mother was cooking in the kitchen and that she must die. Johnny entered the kitchen as she was cooking dinner for the family, while the maid was doing their laundry. Johnny stared at a pan of grease on the stove. As the demonic voice told him, his mind could control any object and make it do whatever he willed it to. So the pan of grease fell to the floor, causing his mother to scream out as the hot grease splattered all over her body. Then she lost her balance and accidentally grabbed the butcher's knife by the blade she was using to chop vegetables. The butcher's knife put a big gash in her hand, and as she was lying on the floor bleeding, Johnny just stared at her as she pleaded with him to call for help. Instead, Johnny's evil will kick in once more, and he made the butcher's knife release from her hand and stab her through the heart, killing her instantly. The maidservant dropped the basket of clothes when she heard screaming and rushed in to see what the commotion was all about. When her eyes gazed upon Johnny's mother lying in a pool of blood with a knife in her chest, she screamed and put her arms around little Johnny, unbeknownst to her, that he was his own mother's killer. She asked Johnny what happened, and he cried and said, "I don't know." The maidservant phoned the police and Johnny's father. Yes, Johnny's father got in his car all shook up over the death of his beautiful wife and hurried back home to see what the police found out. Johnny's father burst through the front door of his house as a white sheet was placed over his dead wife's body. Johnny rushed over to his father in tears, asking his father what happened to his mummy, even though little Johnny knew all along what happened. After the police questioned the maidservant and Johnny, they were both cleared of any wrongdoing. Samantha's death was ruled an accident. Shortly after Johnny's mother's death, he started having dreams that seemed to be real from an evil force that told him he was the son of the devil and not to fear the word of the devil. The next morning, as the maidservant was through cleaning one of the upstairs rooms, she stood at the top of the stairs, glancing over the top rail. There stood below Johnny, staring at her with blazing red eyes. The maid was in a trance-like state with his red eyes, and she could not move. Then a demonic voice whispered in Johnny's ear and said, "Johnny, tell her to jump on top of the rail, and then jump off. Then tell her to spread her arms apart, because she can fly like a bird." The maid did as Johnny asked, jumped off the rail with her arms spread like an eagle, and fell to her death. And later that evening, Johnny's father ran home from a business trip and got the shock of his life when he entered the door of his mansion, and there lying on the floor in a pool of blood was his maid, dead. He ran upstairs to ask his son what happened, and Johnny replied, "She climbed on top of the rail and said, 'Look, Johnny, I can fly.' Then she hit the floor in front of me, and I shook her and told her to get up, but she didn't move." "That's okay, Johnny. I think the passing of your mother did her in, and that's why she's no longer with us," explained Johnny's father. Johnny's father started having dreams of Johnny coming in his bedroom while he was asleep, trying to kill him with a knife, but he would wake up before the blade penetrated his chest. One night, while Johnny was sleeping, his father came to check on him before he turned in for the night, and noticed something that looked like numbers between his earlobe, and decided to take a closer look with a flashlight. He couldn't believe what he saw. The numbers 666 were branded on his skin and decided he should call a priest and see if this is something he should be concerned about. Johnny's father went to bed for the night, and in the morning, he phoned the priest to see what his thoughts were on the numbers branded behind his son's ear. The priest replied, "I do believe you should have a lot to be concerned about. Those 3 numbers represent the mark of the beast, and the devil possesses your son. I will come over. I will bless your house. Perform an exorcism on your son if needed." "Thank you, Father. I will wait for your arrival," replied Mike. Right as the priest set off to bless Mike's house, Johnny appeared in the back seat of his car and said, "Hey, the priest is going somewhere." The priest swerved off the road and almost hit a tree. Then Johnny said, "I think it's getting hot in here." Johnny started laughing in a demonic voice as the car caught on fire. The priest and his car burned beyond recognition. Johnny's father went upstairs to tell Johnny that the priest was coming over to bless their house. But when he opened his bedroom door, Johnny was playing quietly with his toys. Johnny's father just smiled and shut his door, went downstairs to wait on the priest, but hours passed and there were no sign of the priest. Mike tried phoning the priest at the church to see if he just forgot, but another priest answered and said, "A charred body in a car burned beyond recognition was found to be that of the priest you were calling." Mike said, "He was on his way to my house to bless it because I found some numbers branded behind my son's ear that he said I should be concerned about." The priest